On our third wedding anniversary inside our luxury Tribeca penthouse, my husband clipped a pair of flawless diamond earrings onto my ears and whispered, "Nothing but perfection for my wife." But the moment he left for the shower, I noticed the earrings felt strangely heavy. I secretly had them examined by a cybersecurity expert and discovered hidden biometric trackers and live audio transmitters inside the diamonds. My billionaire husband had been monitoring my heartbeat, my conversations my entire life. So instead of confronting him, I slipped one earring into his young assistant's designer handbag. 20 minutes later, my husband heard something that changed everything. Thank you for listening with me today. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you right now. Your voice here truly matters. Just a quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. The heart of this story, the message is what I hope stays with you. When my husband fastened the diamond earrings to my ears on our third anniversary, I should have known they weren't a gift, they were a leash. I was 27 years old that evening, a former litigation attorney with an active New York bar license who had traded courtrooms for walk-in closets 3 years earlier when I married Ronan Henderson. The career hadn't been my idea to abandon. Neither had most decisions in the past 36 months. Ronan appeared in the doorway of our Tribeca penthouse walk-in closet at precisely 7 p.m., black velvet box in hand, wearing the Tom Ford tuxedo I'd collected from the tailor that morning. 35 years old, CEO of a financial conglomerate worth $500 million, he moved through our apartment with the quiet confidence of a man who had never heard the word no and wouldn't recognize it if he did. "Close your eyes," he said. I obeyed. Not because I trusted him, I'd stopped trusting Ronan Henderson approximately 18 months into our marriage, but because refusing would trigger questions. I didn't have energy to deflect. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in an emerald silk dress, feeling his presence behind me, hearing the velvet box snap open with a soft click. "You can look now." The diamonds caught the closet's recessed lighting and threw it back in sharp, cold fragments. Each earring held a stone I estimated at 2.3 carats, flawless clarity, colorless grade platinum setting. Museum-quality pieces. "I had these sourced through a private dealer," Ronan said, lifting one earring from its silk cushion. "Flawless clarity, perfect for your dress tonight." His fingers brushed my earlobe as he fastened the first earring. Cold touch, precise movements. I watched his reflection in the mirror and saw the expression I'd learned to catalog over 3 years of marriage, the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. That wasn't quite a smile, the way his eyes tracked my reaction with the focus of someone conducting an experiment waiting to document results. I knew that look. I'd seen it 3 months earlier when he'd slid the post-nuptial amendment across our breakfast table pen already uncapped. "Just a formality, darling. Estate planning. Our attorneys recommend it." The document had stripped me of nearly every asset protection I'd entered the marriage with. I'd signed it anyway because I hadn't yet learned what I know now, that saying no to Ronan Henderson required more than refusal. It required strategy. "Thank you," I said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "They're beautiful. Nothing but the best for you." He fastened the second earring, his breath warm against my neck. "You look stunning, my perfect wife." The weight of the diamonds pulled at my earlobes heavier than I'd expected. I turned my head slightly, watching light fracture through the stones. Something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, not wrong enough to articulate, just off. How many times had I seen that expression? How many traps had I walked into before I learned to see them coming? The post-nup 3 months ago. The suggestion 1 month ago that I take a break from the litigation firm where I'd made junior partner, a suggestion that became expectation, that became reality, when Ronan mentioned to the managing partner that I was focusing on family planning. I'd resigned the following week, my active bar license, now expensive wall decoration. Before that, the joint checking account he'd consolidated into his name for better tax optimization. The credit cards that required his secondary approval. The apartment lease that listed him as primary, me as occupant. Small erosions. Death by 1,000 signatures. But I had learned something Ronan didn't know I knew. Before my father's stroke 3 years ago, Before Vernon Vance's body betrayed him in a hospital corridor, leaving him silent in a long-term care facility, he had secured an $800,000 civil judgment in my name. A trust he'd structured to survive marriage, divorce, bankruptcy. Seed capital. I'd quietly leveraged through a shell company Ronan had never discovered. My husband assumed I was contained, controlled, comfortable in my gilded cage. He was wrong. "Darling, we should leave soon," Ronan said, checking his Patek Philippe. "The car is waiting." "Of course, just one moment." I touched the earrings, feeling their unnatural weight, the way they seemed to pull not just down but inward, as if the metal itself carried density beyond its physical mass. Ronan stood behind me, adjusting his cufflinks, watching my reflection with that calculating expression. 3 years of marriage had taught me to read him the way a sailor reads weather's small signs that forecast coming storms. The tightness in his jaw meant he was planning something. The way he touched my shoulder, possessive, proprietary, meant he believed he'd already won. The earrings weren't just jewelry, they were a message I hadn't yet learned to read. I turned from the mirror to face him, offering the flawless smile I'd perfected over 36 months of charity galas and carefully orchestrated public appearances. The smile that said I was grateful, compliant his. "They're perfect," I said. He leaned down and kissed my cheek, dry lips, brief contact, the kind of affection that photographed well but felt like paperwork. Nothing but perfection for my wife. I accepted his arm as we walked toward the penthouse elevator, my heels clicking against Italian marble. The diamonds felt cold against my earlobes, heavier than they should be, as if they carried more than just precious stones. I had learned over 3 years of marriage that when Ronan gave me something beautiful, he was already calculating what he would take in return. The postnup had cost me asset protection. Quitting the firm had cost me professional identity. Every gift came with invisible price tags I didn't see until the bill arrived. But I didn't know yet that this time he wasn't planning to take something. He was planning to take everything. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing us in mirrored walls and soft lighting. I watched our reflection, the perfect couple dressed for Manhattan's elite diamonds, catching light, his hand possessive on my waist. I smiled at him. He smiled back. Neither smile reached our eyes. By morning, I would discover exactly what my anniversary gift was designed to steal. The gala ended at 10:43. By 11:14, I learned exactly how my father ended up in a hospital bed with a machine breathing for him. Ronan's phone lit up on the nightstand, while water ran in the master bathroom shower. I had maybe 90 seconds, the length of his standard post-event routine, before he'd emerge toweling his hair and asking if I'd enjoyed the evening. I crossed the bedroom in bare feet, emerald dress already unzipped, and lifted his phone. No passcode. He'd never needed one. His wife was contained, controlled, no threat at all. The email sat at the top of his inbox, sent at 10:47 p.m., while we'd been in the car returning home. From Chester Rivera, subject, re Vernon Vance. Final confirmation. I tapped it open. Vernon Vance IP acquisition complete per your 2020 directive. Source code transferred through shell entities trail cold. Statute of limitations expires April 2026. Exposure risk 0. Marriage containment is successful. Congratulations on 3 years. The shower water continued its steady rhythm. I read the email twice more, committing every word to memory, then scrolled down to the thread history. March 2020. Hire the necessary specialists. I want his entire patent portfolio and I want it untraceable. August 2020. Morgan's bankruptcy filing confirmed. Recommendation: pursue the daughter. Active bar license, litigation background, potential risk if she investigates independently. Suggest direct neutralization through marriage. November 2020. Engagement secured. Wedding scheduled March 2021. My father's stroke had happened in September 2022, weeks after his company collapsed under mysterious circumstances. IP theft, they'd said. Corporate espionage. No proof, no leads, just Vernon Vance's life's work vanishing into offshore shells while his bank accounts went negative, and stress triggered a cerebrovascular event that left him silent in a long-term care bed. I had spent 3 years believing it was random, market forces, bad luck. But Ronan Henderson had orchestrated every second of it, then married me to ensure I'd never discover the truth. The shower water continued its steady rhythm. I kept the diamond earrings firmly on my ears, maintaining my tactical breathing to lock my pulse in place. The biometric sensor in my left earring would show my husband exactly what he expected, a tired wife preparing for bed, pulse slightly elevated from the evening's socializing, completely oblivious. I returned the phone to its exact coordinates on the nightstand, 17 centimeters from the lamp base parallel to the table edge, and walked to the walk-in closet just as the shower stopped. "Are you tired, honey?" Ronan called from the bathroom. "Not at all," I said. "The night is just beginning." 3 years. 3 years I had been married to the man who put my father in a coma. 3 years sleeping beside the architect of my family's destruction, smiling at his business partners, wearing the jewelry he selected, living in the prison he'd constructed specifically for me. The earrings felt different now, not heavy, not suspicious. Lethal. I waited until Ronan fell asleep, his breathing evening out at 11:52 p.m., then moved to the study and opened the encrypted laptop I'd purchased 3 weeks earlier with cash. The laptop Ronan didn't know existed. I typed a single message to a Miami number I'd researched for the past month. "Initial assessment correct, proceeding to phase 1. The response came within 90 seconds. Confirmed. Saturday 900, usual location. I closed the laptop, returned to bed, and lay beside my husband in the dark, listening to him breathe. The earrings pressed cold against my skin, his surveillance system, his control mechanism, his mistake. By 9:07 Saturday morning, I was stepping out of an Uber in Brooklyn Heights, 25 minutes, and a world away from the Tribeca penthouse. Rhett Ward answered his door in a faded MIT t-shirt and diagnostic magnification goggles pushed up on his forehead. 29 years old white hat security consultant, and the only person I trusted with my life. His basement apartment smelled like burnt resin and solder flux blue monitors, casting everything in cold light. "You wore them," he said, looking at the earrings. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." He gestured to a workstation covered in precision tools and circuit board fragments. "Sit. Don't move your head too much. If they're transmitting sudden movement, might trigger alerts." I sat. Rhett wheeled his chair close, adjusting a stereo microscope until its twin lenses focused on my right ear. His hands moved with surgical precision as he worked the earring's clasp free. "Acoustic transmitter," he said, placing the diamond under magnification. "Live signal. Active range approximately 50 meters. Commercial-grade surveillance tech, the kind corporate security uses for executive protection or monitoring." He reached for the left earring. "And this one's the prize. Biometric sensor, heart rate, skin temperature, probably galvanic response if it's sophisticated enough. Real-time physiological monitoring." He looked up from the microscope. "You know it's actively transmitting right now, don't you?" "I do. He's watching your vital signs. Every heartbeat, every temperature fluctuation. Any spike in your pulse, he'll know you're stressed. Any drop in temperature, he'll know you're afraid." Some women would have thrown the earrings into the East River. Some would have confronted him immediately, demanded explanations, threatened lawyers and police and public scandal. I did neither. "Put them back in," I said. Rhett stared at me. "You're serious." "Completely." He refastened the first earring with careful hands, then the second. I stood and walked to the small bathroom mirror, adjusting each diamond until they caught the fluorescent light perfectly. The acoustic chip in my right ear was live, transmitting every sound within a 50-meter radius directly to my husband's surveillance dashboard. The biometric sensor in my left ear was feeding him my pulse, my body temperature, every physiological tell that might indicate discovery or fear. Let him watch. Let him listen. Because the woman whose vital signs he was monitoring was no longer his wife, she was his executioner, and the trial had just begun. "From this moment forward," I said, watching my reflection, "I am the only one who decides exactly what he hears." The next phase required learning to control what those sensors could and couldn't detect. 3 days later, I sat in Rhett's lab with electrodes taped to my wrist and chest, staring at a monitor that displayed my heartbeat in real-time green waves. The first time Rhett read the email aloud, the one confirming my husband had orchestrated my father's destruction, my heart rate spiked from 62 to 84 beats per minute in less than 3 seconds. 22 beats, Rhett said, tapping the monitor where the spike formed a jagged mountain on the graph. If Ronan saw that variance through the biometric sensor, he would know. He would know everything. I stared at the screen, watching my pulse gradually descend. The green line smoothed, but the damage was recorded, a perfect physiological confession. How long do I have? I asked. Before what? Before I need to wear them again. Before he starts asking questions. Rhett checked his watch. You removed them Saturday morning. Today is Tuesday. 3 days of professional cleaning is reasonable. 5 days he'll know something's wrong. 5 days. I had 5 days to learn what intelligence operatives trained months to master complete autonomic control. Show me how, I said. Rhett pulled up a military tactical breathing manual on his monitor sections highlighted in yellow. Box breathing, he said. 4-count inhale, 4-count hold, 4-count exhale, 4-count hold. Your autonomic system can be trained like any other muscle. The goal isn't to eliminate emotional response that's impossible and would register as abnormal. The goal is to prevent spikes beyond 5 beats per minute when exposed to psychological triggers. He adjusted the electrodes on my chest, checking calibration. We're going to run the email test again. This time, focus on the breathing pattern. Don't fight the emotion when you hear the words. Redirect it. Anger is fuel. Fear is data. Neither controls your pulse unless you let it. I closed my eyes and established the rhythm. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. The monitor showed my baseline settling at 62. Ready? Rhett asked. I nodded. He read the email in a flat clinical voice. R.E. Vernon Morgan. IP acquisition complete per your 2020 directive. Source code transferred through shell entities trail cold. Statute of limitations expires April 2026. Marriage containment successful. The rage arrived like a flash fire. I felt it in my chest, my jaw, my clenched hands, but I held the breathing pattern. The monitor spiked to 73. 11 beats, Rhett said. Better, again. We ran it 17 times over the next 2 hours. 17 times I heard the words that confirmed my husband had destroyed my father specifically to marry me. 17 times I forced my nervous system to comply with a rhythm that had nothing to do with what I felt and everything to do with survival. How many women had sat in this exact position wired to machines, learning to hide their fear from the men who claimed to love them? How many had failed? At 11:30, Rhett ran the test again. This time, I didn't just focus on the breathing. I focused on my father's ventilator rhythm, the steady mechanical inhale-exhale I'd memorized during hospital visits, the sound that meant he was still alive. I anchored my pulse to that rhythm, instead of my rage. Rhett read the email. The monitor climbed from 62 to 66, 4 beats, then settled back. That's it, Rhett said quietly. 4-beat variance. Ronan's system would register that as normal stress response, nothing abnormal, you just passed. I opened my eyes and looked at the monitor. The green line had barely trembled. During the brief rest interval, I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag and opened a dashboard Rhett wasn't supposed to see. Kensington Capital, the shell company I'd established with my father's trust. Current holdings 40% of Ronan's outstanding corporate convertible bonds, acquired through 12 months of microtransactions small enough to stay below institutional radar. Every share purchased through layered offshore entities. I closed the laptop before Rhett could see the full scope. One more test, he said, the hardest one. He positioned a webcam on the desk at eye level, angling it to simulate someone sitting across from me. Smiling, he said. Smiling while keeping your pulse locked at 62. Anyone can maintain baseline in a neutral state, but you need to perform affection while your physiology stays completely controlled. Look into that webcam like it's him. Smile like you love him. And don't let your heart betray you. I wasn't learning to control my heart. I was learning to become the weapon he had tried to disarm by marrying me. I established the breathing pattern, 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts. The monitor showed 62. I looked directly into the webcam lens, imagining Ronan's face, his calculating expression, the cold smile he'd worn while fastening the surveilled earrings to my ears. And I smiled. Warm, genuine, loving. The monitor didn't move. 62 beats per minute, steady as death. Perfect, Rhett whispered. That's perfect. He disconnected the electrodes and handed me my coat, his expression carrying something close to awe. You'll be able to fool him completely, he said. As long as you maintain the breathing, he'll never know what you've discovered. He thought this training was about surviving my marriage. He didn't know I'd been preparing for this war since the day I signed my maiden name on the Kensington Capital Incorporation papers 3 years ago, 6 months before I ever said I do. The question was never whether I could deceive Ronan's surveillance. The question was how long I would let him believe he was watching me when I had already positioned myself to watch everything he owned burn. The corporate gala was 5 days away, and I had one more asset to acquire before I could execute the first strike. The asset was Otelia Cooper, and I acquired her 5 days later at a corporate gala on a Manhattan rooftop. I spotted her the moment I stepped onto the terrace, 26 years old, form-fitting red dress and a Birkin bag worth more than most assistants earn in 6 months. Ronan's executive assistant, his mistress, and according to 5 days of metadata forensics, his industrial espionage problem. I circulated through the crowd with a champagne flute I never drank from, playing the role I'd perfected, the corporate wife, smiling at partners, laughing at appropriate intervals. My right earring, the biometric sensor, transmitted a steady 62 beats per minute to Ronan's surveillance dashboard. Perfect compliance, perfect control. Otelia Cooper stood near the marble bar station, phone in hand, texting with the screen angled carefully away from the crowd. I'd watched her do this 17 times over the past week through strategic positioning at venues where our paths accidentally crossed. Always the same careful angle, always shielding the screen. 5 days of surveillance had revealed what Ronan either didn't know or chose to ignore. His assistant wasn't just sleeping with him, she was selling him out. 3. Henderson Financial Group internal emails. Quarterly projections. M&A strategy briefs, client acquisition targets had been blind carbon copied to a secure domain registered to Meridian Capital, Ronan's fiercest competitor. The metadata didn't lie. Neither did Otelia's lifestyle. Michelin-starred restaurants twice weekly, resort weekends in the Bahamas, designer bags that rotated faster than seasons. Executive assistants earned $78,000 annually at Henderson Financial. Otelia's spending patterns suggested income closer to $300,000. The math was simple, the betrayal was layered. A woman beside me, wife of Henderson's CFO, leaned close and gestured toward Otelia with her wine glass. "That's Henderson's new assistant," she said. "Gorgeous, isn't she? He spoils that girl." "He certainly does," I said, sipping champagne I wouldn't taste. My pulse held steady at 62. The biometric sensor reported nothing but mild social stress, exactly what Ronan would expect. I wasn't the prey in this surveillance game anymore. I was the hunter, and I had just armed my target with his own loaded gun. At 8:45, the jazz ensemble increased volume for their signature number. The crowd density at the bar peaked as guests refreshed drinks between networking circuits. I positioned myself 7 feet from Otelia, who had just returned her phone to her Birkin and was adjusting her champagne glass on the marble countertop. The bag hung open on her left arm, phone visible in the interior pocket, keys, lipstick, the disorganized chaos of someone who didn't expect surveillance. I moved. The collision looked entirely accidental, my heel catching on the slight elevation change between terrace sections, my shoulder bumping hers as I stumbled forward. She steadied me with her free hand. I caught myself against the marble bar edge. "I'm so sorry," I said, straightening. "Caught my heel on the step. Are you all right?" "Completely fine, no worries at all," Otelia said, smoothing her dress. The entire interaction lasted 2 seconds. Exactly the duration Ronan had taught me during a first-year vacation parlor trick demonstration, sleight-of-hand corporate entertainment. Watch me make this card disappear. The student had just become the master. My left diamond earring, the acoustic transmitter, now sat nestled in Otelia's Birkin interior pocket, pressed between her leather wallet and phone case. I adjusted my right earring, the biometric sensor still transmitting to Ronan, and apologized again. Otelia accepted graciously and returned to her phone. My left earlobe felt conspicuously light, empty, exposed. But only I would notice, and Ronan if he looked closely. I moved to the perimeter balcony, putting distance between myself and the crowded bar. Manhattan stretched below in geometric precision grid lines and illuminated windows, millions of lives conducting their ordinary business while I executed tactical warfare on a rooftop. My breathing held the pattern. 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts. The monitor would show 62 beats per minute, relaxed socializing, nothing unusual. Some women would have confronted the mistress. Some would have exposed her immediately to Ronan, weaponizing the betrayal for divorce leverage or emotional destruction. I did something far more elegant. I made her useful. Inside Otelia's designer bag, Microscopic hardware waited patiently, as I had waited for 3 years. The acoustic transmitter would capture every conversation she had with Meridian Capital contacts, every industrial espionage transaction, every whispered phone call in recessed alcoves where she thought privacy existed. And when Ronan eventually checked his surveillance dashboard, when he noticed the GPS coordinate split between my position on the balcony and the left earring's location still moving through the gala crowd inside Attilia's bag, his paranoia would trigger exactly as I'd designed it to. He would access the audio stream expecting to hear his wife's betrayal. Instead, he would hear his mistress selling his company's secrets to his enemies. The trap wasn't for her, she was just the bait. Ronan had built a surveillance system to control me, to ensure I never discovered what he'd done to my father, to keep me contained in the marriage he'd strategically engineered. I had just transformed that system into the weapon that would make him destroy his own carefully constructed lies. I stepped back into the crowded gala, touching my right earring, the biometric sensor still transmitting my perfectly controlled pulse. My left earlobe felt light, empty, free. Inside Attilia Cooper's designer bag, a microscopic piece of hardware waited like a landmine. The question wasn't what would happen when Ronan discovered the GPS coordinate split. The question was simply when my husband would pull his own string and detonate everything he thought he'd so carefully protected. I had less than 24 hours before that detonation would force his hand. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes after I planted the transmitter, I watched my husband pull out his phone across the crowded rooftop, and I knew the moment he saw the GPS coordinate split because his entire body went rigid. He was standing near the jazz ensemble, martini in hand, conversing with board members. Then his eyes dropped to the phone screen. His shoulders locked. His jaw tightened with the micro-expression I'd cataloged over 3 years, the look that meant something was wrong. He scanned the crowd methodically until his gaze found me near the glass entry doors. Then he started walking toward me. My heart rate, which had held perfectly at 62 beats per minute through the entire plant, through 20 minutes of casual socializing, began to climb. 65, 68, 72. I deployed the tactical breathing. 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts, 4 counts. 76, 80, 84. 22 beats above baseline. 8 beats above the safe variance threshold. If he was monitoring the biometric dashboard actively, if he looked at his phone right now, he would see the spike. He would know. "Is everything all right?" Ronan asked, his voice tight. I caught my heel on the step near the terrace, I said, gesturing vaguely toward the marble bar. "I think the leather is loose." "Why?" My voice sounded perfectly casual. My heart hammered against my ribs. He studied me for 3 seconds. 3 seconds where I focused every trained instinct on maintaining the breathing pattern, on keeping my expression neutral. Then he nodded slowly. "Nothing," he said, "just checking in." He turned and walked back toward the board member's phone still in his hand. I had trained for this moment. 2 hours of tactical breathing drills with Rhett, simulated trigger scenarios, biometric control conditioning designed specifically for high-stress field deployment. And I had nearly failed within 20 minutes of execution. I excused myself and moved to the ladies' room, locking myself in a stall until my heart rate descended. When I emerged 7 minutes later, Ronan was on the opposite side of the terrace, phone tucked away. The crisis had passed, by milliseconds. Saturday evening at 10 p.m., I sat in the dark Tribeca living room while Ronan worked in his locked home office. My secondary phone, the encrypted device Rhett had configured, vibrated once with a passive alert. Ronan had just opened the left earring's audio stream. He was listening. But the transmitter wasn't in my possession. It was in Attilia Cooper's apartment across town, capturing whatever conversation she was having at that exact moment. I waited. 4 minutes later, through the shared office wall, I heard the violent crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Mahogany desk organizer based on the timbre resonance I'd memorized from 3 years of living here. Then Ronan's voice, muffled but venomous, speaking into his phone. "Terminate Cooper, tonight, full NDA enforcement, 0 severance." Silence. Then, "I don't care what she's in the middle of. Get her security credentials revoked and have her escorted from whatever location she's currently at. I want her out within 30 minutes. The line cut. Dead silence followed. I sat in the dark living room, monitoring the passive alert that confirmed Ronan's device had accessed the audio stream for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He had just stepped directly into his own trap using his own surveillance architecture, the architect destroyed by his own blueprint. Ronan had built a surveillance empire to monitor me, I had just converted it into an evidence generation machine that would grind him into federal indictment. Monday afternoon, at 3 p.m., I returned to Rhett's Brooklyn lab. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, coffee mug stacked on his workstation, blue monitor glow reflecting off exhausted eyes. "Show me," I said. He pulled up a file tree on his display. Hundreds of interconnected nodes color-coded by access level. "This is Henderson Financial's dual ledger accounting system," Rhett said. "I didn't hack anything. I didn't deploy spyware. I just followed the metadata." He clicked through email routing headers, server timestamps, file access logs, all publicly visible digital footprints left by Otilia's communications when she'd accessed restricted financial files. Every time she accessed these files, she left traces, email headers showing which servers processed her requests, timestamps showing when she logged in. He traced a path through the network topology. I just followed the footprints backward until I found the architecture. The display showed a complete map of Henderson Financial's offshore shell structure. Cayman entities, BVI holding companies, a systematic tax evasion system totaling $180 million in concealed assets. "This is forensic metadata reconstruction," Rhett said. "Your attorney can file Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 34 document discovery demand using this map as foundation. The court will order Ronan to produce these exact files. Completely legal, completely admissible, completely devastating." "How long until Desmond can file?" I asked. "He has everything he needs, tomorrow morning if he moves fast." I stood up from the workstation, tucking the metadata analysis USB drive into my coat pocket. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Desmond Foster would walk that forensic map into the New York Supreme Court and file the discovery motion that would crack open Ronan's financial architecture like a fault line splitting granite. But tonight I had one more stop to make, a weekly obligation I had never missed in 3 years, not even when my world was burning down. My father was waiting at New York Presbyterian, and I needed to tell him the war had officially begun. The war began officially on Tuesday morning when Desmond Foster handed me the evidence that would end my husband's freedom. The manila envelope he slid across his conference table contained 3 pages that would destroy Ronan, court-ordered discovery revealing $180 million in systematic tax evasion over 4 years. Desmond Foster, 38. My former law school classmate turned managing partner of a midtown boutique firm sat across from me with the steady composure of a man who had just secured the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. "FRCP Rule 34 discovery cleared this morning," he said. "Court ordered full production. What we're looking at isn't creative accounting, it's systematic international tax fraud across 12 jurisdictions." I pulled the first page from the envelope. Wire transfer records, entity formations, beneficial ownership structures mapped across 3 Cayman Islands shell companies. 4 years of documentation showing how Henderson Financial had systematically diverted assets through offshore vehicles designed to evade federal tax obligations. "Not a marital asset dispute," I said. "No," Desmond confirmed. "This is a federal criminal blueprint. SEC DOJ, potentially FinCEN, if the wire transfers crossed certain thresholds." I skimmed the second page. More entities, more transfers, more evidence of deliberate calculated fraud executed with institutional precision. "Finalize the Dodd-Frank whistleblower filing for the SEC Enforcement Division this week," I said. "I want federal statutory protection locked before he realizes what's coming." 15 USC, Section 78U-6, Desmond said, pulling up the statute on his laptop. "Absolute protection against corporate or personal retaliation for SEC whistleblowers. Once we file, he can't touch you legally without triggering additional federal charges." "How long?" 72 hours. I'll have it submitted by Friday afternoon." I looked down at the 3 pages on the conference table. Court-stamped bond paper, black ink, wire routing numbers, shell company registration certificates. The entire architecture of Ronan Henderson's financial crimes laid out in administrative prose. A billionaire undone by 3 sheets of court-stamped bond paper. All his surveillance, all his control, all his paranoia, and he never saw the legal architecture I was building in plain sight. "This is the weapon that strips him of everything," Desmond said quietly. "Not everything," I said, sliding the pages back into the envelope. "Just his freedom, his assets, his reputation, his carefully constructed empire. I stood up, tucking the manila envelope into my leather bag. "Where are you going?" Desmond asked. "To tell my father the war has officially begun." Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. I sat in the same chair I had occupied every Tuesday for 3 years, watching my father's chest rise and fall in mechanical rhythm. Vernon Vance, 58 years old, lay motionless in the ICU at New York Presbyterian Hospital. The rhythmic hiss of his ventilator was the only sound in the sterile room where I had visited every week since the stroke, the one Ronan Henderson had orchestrated through corporate espionage and bankruptcy that destroyed my father's company and triggered the cerebrovascular event that left him here. 3 years. 156 Tuesdays. 156 visits where I sat beside his bed and told him what I was building brick by brick while machines breathed for him and monitors tracked vitals that never changed. Today I pulled a small folded slip of paper from my coat pocket and a pen from my bag. I wrote 2 names in deliberate script: Ronan Henderson, Elodie Vance, the Destroyer and the Avenger. I didn't write it for him to read. He couldn't read anymore. Couldn't speak. Couldn't move anything except perhaps some deep neurological function the doctors couldn't measure. I wrote it as an oath to my own resolve. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it securely inside the pocket of his hospital gown pressed against his still chest, where nurses would find it eventually, and probably throw it away, never understanding what it meant. "I am halfway through, Dad," I whispered. "The discovery is filed. The federal protection is coming. He doesn't know yet that the cage is closing." His hand lay motionless on the white sheets. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. The ventilator hissed its mechanical breath. 3 years he'd been in this bed. 3 years I'd sat here every Tuesday, building the architecture of Ronan's destruction one strategic move at a time, while my father lay silent and still. Some daughters would have moved on. Some would have accepted the stroke as random tragedy, medical misfortune, the cruel mathematics of cardiovascular failure. I wasn't some daughter. I was the woman who had married her father's destroyer specifically to position myself for total annihilation of everything Ronan Henderson had built on the wreckage of Vernon Morgan's stolen life's work. "Every day you spend in this bed," I whispered, "is a second ticking off the clock I built for him, and that clock is about to strike." The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator maintained its mechanical cycle. My father's chest rose and fell with artificial precision. I stood, adjusted my coat, and moved to the doorway where the evening shift nurse waited to dim the lights. I looked back at him one final time. He lay there motionless, as still as stone, under the harsh fluorescent glare, the ventilator's rhythm the only proof he was still fighting. But every day he spent in that bed was a second ticking off the clock I had built for Ronan Henderson. And that clock was about to strike. 3 days later, I would meet the woman who held the key to Chester Rivera's corporate seals and her own escape. 3 days after I planted the note in my father's hospital gown, I met the woman who would give me access to Chester Rivera's most protected asset. The woman sitting across from me in the secluded cafe wore clothes a decade out of style and held her coffee cup with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since I sat down 40 years old and trapped in a marriage that had systematically erased every avenue of escape. Clarice Rivera sat across from me wearing orthopedic shoes that had seen better years, her trembling hands betraying a woman who had spent the last decade learning exactly how small her husband wanted her to become. 0 bank accounts, 0 friends, 0 escape routes, until this morning. I had chosen this Upper East Side cafe deliberately. The rear alcove had no security cameras. I had pre-ordered 2 coffees and positioned myself where I could see every entrance. She arrived punctually at 10 a.m., scanning the room with the careful wariness of someone who had learned to anticipate surveillance. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. She nodded, but didn't speak yet. Her posture carried a decade of systematic diminishment, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded in her lap, eyes that checked exits instinctively. I had spent 3 weeks auditing Chester Rivera's operational ecosystem, Ronan's exclusive corporate counsel, the attorney who had orchestrated my father's destruction through legal architecture designed to be untraceable. And Chester Rivera, I had learned, exerted total financial and psychological dominance over his wife. 0 independent bank accounts, complete isolation from former friends, monitored phone, controlled schedule, every dollar accounted for, every movement tracked. Financial captivity disguised as marriage. I slid a thick dossier across the marble table. This is your complete asset assessment under the New York Domestic Relations Law, I said. My firm's resources will handle your exit pro bono. I require no financial compensation. Her hands remained folded. She looked at the dossier but didn't touch it. Why? She asked quietly. Because your husband helped destroy my father, and because no woman should live in a cage. She studied my face for a long moment, then slowly reached for the dossier. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Asset inventories, property holdings, projected distribution calculations. Her breathing changed as she processed what she was reading. Freedom quantified in legal prose. You're the woman who's destroying Ronan Henderson, she said softly, still reading. I am. Chester talks about you. When he thinks I'm not paying attention, he thinks I'm just furniture in the house. She looked up from the dossier. But furniture here's everything. There are two kinds of women who end up financially trapped by powerful men. The ones who never see the cage being built, and the ones who see it too late to escape. Clarice Rivera had seen it. She'd just never had the resources to do anything about it until now. What does Chester say? I asked. That you're dangerous, that you filed discovery motions revealing offshore structures, that Ronan is panicking. Her hands had stopped trembling now. That you're not going to stop until everything burns down. He's correct. She closed the dossier and set it carefully on the table beside her coffee. I know what you're doing to my husband's client, she said. Ronan Henderson, and I know why. Let me tell you about the corporate seals. I leaned forward slightly. Chester keeps them in our house, she continued. The official administrative seal of Rivera Law Group. The one Ronan believes only Chester can authorize to legitimize certain financial document executions. Where? Home safe. Second bedroom converted to his private office. The combination is our wedding date backwards, the one date he assumes I'd never use as a code because he knows how much I regret it. She said it without emotion, clinical, precise. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I want out. Because I've spent 10 years watching my husband help men like Ronan Henderson destroy people like your father. And because... She paused, checking the room again, then leaning closer. Because the one thing I've learned in this marriage is that men like Chester and Ronan only understand one language: total destruction. I wasn't just offering her a divorce. I was handing her a key to a prison she'd been locked inside for 10 years, and she was handing me a key to the vault her husband thought only he could open. When can you access the safe? I asked. Tonight. Chester has a client dinner in Midtown. He won't be home until after midnight. How will you get it to me? I won't. She pulled a small notebook from her purse and wrote an address on a blank page, then slid it across the table. You'll come to the house at 9 p.m. I'll have the seal waiting. You photograph it, use what you need, return it before he realizes it's gone. He'll know you let someone into the house. No, she said. He disabled the alarm system 2 years ago because he kept forgetting the code and triggering false alerts. He just tells me it's still active to keep me compliant. But I know it's dead. I've known for 2 years. She checked the room one final time before leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a sharp, deliberate whisper that carried the weight of a decade's suppressed rage. What I can give you has nothing to do with my divorce. It's the one asset my husband keeps in our house that Ronan Henderson believes only Chester can authorize the official corporate seal of Rivera Law Group, and I know exactly where he keeps the combination to his home safe. That same afternoon, I would meet with Rhett to confirm something I'd suspected for weeks, that my husband's corporate security system had a fatal flaw. That same afternoon, I drove to Brooklyn to confirm what I'd suspected for weeks, that the security system my husband trusted to protect his empire had a fatal flaw. The moment Rhett pulled up the enterprise security architecture deployed at Henderson Financial Group's headquarters, his hands froze over the keyboard and a rare, dangerous grin spread across his face. What? I asked. He pointed at the screen. Sentinel Security LLC, firmware version 3.2. The name meant nothing to me. His expression said it meant everything. I was on their core exploit testing team from 2018 to 2021, Rhett said, leaning back in his chair. I logged a critical zero-day vulnerability in this exact version in 2020. Wrote a 40-page report documenting the flaw authentication bypass in the access control layer. Management buried it to save a lucrative contract with corporate clients. They fired me 6 months later for pushing too hard on the security implications. It's still unpatched. 4 years later. His grin widened. Your husband hired the security company that dismissed me for being too thorough, and he installed the exact compromise system I know how to breach. The irony is almost poetic. He pulled up files, technical documentation, exploit, proof of concept code, his original 2020 security assessment with management's rejection stamp clearly visible in red ink across the executive summary. Henderson thought he was buying the impenetrable fortress, Rhett said. He doesn't know he bought the exact door I built the key for years before he ever bought the lock. Let's go inside. The system's arrogance had become its vulnerability, and I had just found the architect of its destruction. What can you access? I asked. Everything. Server logs showing who accessed what files and when. Access timestamps for every badge reader in the building. Digital keys to physical spaces, offices, server rooms, executive suites. Video surveillance feeds if they're network connected, which… He clicked through several screens. They are 17 cameras across 3 floors, badge readers on every secure door, elevator controls, conference room booking systems, even the HVAC controls if we needed them. How long would it take you to… I'm already in, Rhett interrupted, pulling up a live feed from Henderson Financial's 38th floor executive corridor. Been in since you asked me to research their security vendor 2 weeks ago. I just needed confirmation it was actually Sentinel before I told you what we could do with it. Ronan had built his empire on paranoia and control. He thought surveillance and security made him untouchable. He never considered that the fortress walls he paid millions to erect had been compromised before the first brick was laid. 5 days later, Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. I sat across from Desmond Foster in his private conference room signing the documents that would trigger the final countdown. The divorce complaint. 53 pages. New York Supreme Court, Manhattan. Count 1 adultery under NY Domestic Relations Law Section 170 Subdivision 4. Ottilia Cooper's name appeared 17 times in the specifications, each mention supported by dates, locations, and corroborating evidence. I signed the last page with the same Mont Blanc pen I'd used to sign the prenuptial agreement 3 years earlier. The symmetry felt deliberate. And the SEC filing, I asked. Desmond slid a second packet across the polished mahogany table. Dodd-Frank whistleblower submission, direct transmission to SEC Enforcement Division. The moment it hit their servers, I would be covered under Title 15 United States Code Section 78 U-6, absolute federal statutory protection against corporate or personal retaliation. I signed that one too, my handwriting as steady as it had been on every other document in this 3-year campaign. Once he is served, Desmond said, adjusting his reading glasses, a 72-hour window opens before the emergency accounting preservation orders freeze his server access. He will attempt to scrub evidence, move assets, destroy records. It's what they always do. That is exactly why we filed today, I said. I want him to run. Every panicked move he makes creates more evidence. Every deleted file leaves a forensic trail. Every wire transfer generates documentation. Desmond studied me for a long moment. You're escalating deliberately. I am. Most clients in your position would wait. Build more evidence. Play it safe. I'm not interested in safe, I said. I'm interested in results. Some women would have waited. Some would have built more evidence, delayed another month, played it safe. I wasn't interested in safe. I was interested in watching him destroy himself with the same tools he'd used to try to control me. Once this hits the clerk's desk, Desmond said carefully, there is no off-ramp. No negotiated settlement, no quiet dissolution. This becomes a federal case with criminal implications the moment that SEC filing transmits to their servers. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, meeting his eyes with absolute certainty. I lost my off-ramp the night he clipped those diamonds to my ears, I said. Serve him. Desmond lifted the phone to call the process server, his finger hovering over the dial button for one final confirmation. This was the point of no return, the moment everything became irreversible. I nodded once, sharp and absolute. He pressed the button. Desmond Foster for Martinez Process Service. I have a priority delivery for today. Manhattan Tribeca. Henderson Residence. Target delivery 6 p.m. He read off the address slowly, deliberately. Divorce complaint and supplemental federal documentation. Signature required. Bill to my account. He hung up and looked at me with something approaching respect. Somewhere across Manhattan, I said, "A legal courier just received our address." And in 72 hours, Desmond added, "The accounting preservation order hits. Every server, every account, every transaction frozen for forensic examination." "What will he do first?" I asked. "Call Chester Rivera. His attorney will tell him to do nothing, say nothing, touch nothing. Standard crisis management protocol." And then he'll panic anyway. They always do. The ones who think they're untouchable, they're the worst when the walls start closing in. The 72-hour countdown had begun, and Ronan Henderson had no idea the clock was already ticking. By evening, the papers would be in his hands, and I would be standing in our living room watching his world fracture in real time. The process server arrived at 6:14 p.m., 14 minutes later than scheduled, and the moment Ronan opened the unsealed manila envelope, I watched 3 years of carefully constructed control dissolve from his face in less than 30 seconds. Marcus Delaney stood in our foyer with the quiet efficiency of someone who had delivered bad news 1,000 times before. 28 years old, former paralegal, turned process server, he had worked at Foster Law Partners during my second year there, before realizing he preferred the simplicity of delivery over the complexity of litigation. Desmond had recommended him for exactly this reason. Marcus understood discretion timing and the art of disappearing before the reaction began. "Ronan Henderson." Marcus's voice was neutral professional. Ronan glanced up from his laptop at the dining table, his expression shifting from irritation at the interruption to confusion at the stranger in our home. "Yes. You've been served." Marcus extended the envelope, waited for Ronan to take it, then turned toward the door, without another word. I had positioned myself near the kitchen, close enough to observe, but far enough to appear uninvolved, just a wife witnessing an unexpected delivery. The door clicked shut. Ronan stared at the envelope for 3 seconds before opening it. I watched his eyes move across the first page. "Complaint for divorce." His jaw tightened. The second page, "Grounds adultery," with Ottilia Cooper's name typed in 12-point font beneath New York Domestic Relations Law, Section 170. The color drained from his face so quickly, I could track the progression from his forehead down to his collar. Then he reached the third page and everything stopped. The SEC whistleblower office stamp sat in the upper right corner, dated 2 days ago, case number blacked out but unmistakably federal. Below it, a single sentence in bold: "Complainant is a registered whistleblower under 15 U.S.C. Section 78 U-6 and entitled to all protections thereunder." Ronan's hands began to shake. It wasn't the divorce that broke him, it was the inversion. The moment he understood that I wasn't just leaving him, I was protected by the same federal infrastructure he had spent years evading. Every threat he might have considered, every pressure tactic, every legal maneuver designed to intimidate or silence, all rendered impotent by 7 words entitled to all protections thereunder. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw genuine fear. When his voice was barely audible, "The SEC transmission was verified at 2 o'clock. I kept my tone neutral, factual. "Your 72 hours started 4 hours ago." He stared at me like I was speaking a language he had never learned. 72 hours to respond to the divorce complaint. I moved to the counter, poured myself a glass of water with hands that did not shake. "New York law, the clock is running." Ronan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood, and disappeared into his office without another word. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. How many times had I imagined this moment? How many nights had I lain awake, rehearsing the expression on his face? The exact angle of his collapse, reality, as it turned out, was quieter than fantasy. No shouting, no confrontation, just a man retreating into a room to calculate his remaining options. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and went to the bedroom. At 11 p.m., I lay in the dark living room with my right earring active. Ronan's office shared a wall with the space behind our couch thin enough for Rhett's surveillance modification to capture every word spoken at normal volume. I had turned off all the lights, stretched out on the leather cushions with my phone face down on my chest, and waited. The first call came at 11:14 p.m. "Chester." Ronan's voice was tight, controlled panic barely contained. "I need the 2022 post-nuptial protection clause activated immediately. Yes, tonight. I don't care what time it is in Sao Paulo, wake him up and get the Cayman trustee on his signature page before sunrise." Chester Rivera. Ronan's offshore attorney, the architect of the shell structure that had hidden assets across 3 continents. I had expected this call, Desmond had already drafted the counter motion to freeze the trust transfer, time to file the moment Chester's paperwork hit the registry. The second call came 18 minutes later. It's me. Ronan's tone had shifted, less panic, more calculation. Elodie's name needs to be purged from every registry by tomorrow morning. Corporate filings, investment accounts, property records. If her name appears anywhere in our structure, I want it gone. Scrub it completely. His CFO, the man who had signed off on every fraudulent quarterly report for the past 3 years. I made a mental note of the timeline tomorrow morning. Desmond would need to file the restraining order on asset modification by 8 a.m. The third call came at 11:47 p.m., and I didn't recognize the voice on the other end. The Cayman reserves need to move to BVI tonight. Ronan's words came faster, now urgency bleeding through the careful control. I don't care about the transfer fees. I need those funds outside U.S. jurisdiction before the SEC starts issuing subpoenas. Can you execute the wire by morning? A pause. Then good. Use the tertiary routing we set up in 2023. Nothing traceable to Henderson Capital. I lay perfectly still, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. He had reached out to 3 people in his crisis sequence. I knew 2: Chester Rivera and his CFO. The third voice on that came into BVI call was unfamiliar, unidentified, urgent. And whoever they were, they had access to offshore accounts I didn't know existed. The third voice haunted me through the next morning, but I had no time to chase ghosts. Clarice Rivera was waiting in a midtown parking structure with something more immediate. She held the corporate seal like a trophy, its brass weight catching the parking structure's fluorescent glare. We stood between Pillar G and H on level 3, the space nearly empty at 3:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. An engine echoed 3 levels below. Chester keeps his safe codes in a leather notebook, Clarice said, extending the seal toward me. Second shelf behind the scotch. He thinks I don't notice. I took it carefully. The seal was warm from her grip, heavier than expected. Chester Rivera's New York State Bar corporate seal, the instrument he had used to notarize offshore trust documents for 3 years. I hold an active New York State Notary Public Commission, Clarice continued. Every document I notarize will be legally binding, unimpeachable. She had walked into her husband's home, the man orchestrating my husband's fraud, and stolen his corporate seal. The audacity was breathtaking. Then she produced a red folder from her bag. The label read Vance Contingency in precise attorney script. What's in the Vance folder? I asked. Insurance. Clarice's expression remained neutral. For when Chester realizes what side of history he chose. The red folder sat between us like a loaded weapon. Vance. The name meant nothing to me then. But the way Clarice held it protective, deliberate, suggested it would. The smell of motor oil and concrete dust filled the space between us. Clarice placed the folder back in her bag without opening it. Friday morning, she said. Emergency hearing. Be ready. She walked toward the stairwell without waiting for a response, her heels clicking against concrete until the sound disappeared into the structure's acoustic void. Thursday night, Desmond Foster spread case files across my Brooklyn kitchen table. Traffic rumbled through closed windows. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, untouched. The postnuptial amendment is their cornerstone, Desmond said, tapping the document with his pen. If it stands, Ronan shields 40% of the Kensington bonds. It won't stand. Desmond looked up. You sound certain. I replaced his desk pen 3 days before he signed it. The fluorescent kitchen light cast blue-white shadows across Desmond's face as he processed this. You're telling me you swapped his desk pen 72 hours in advance? Thermochromic ink breaks down at 85 degrees, I said. Halogen courtroom lights hit 90. I had watched Ronan sign contracts at that desk for 3 years. I knew he never checked his pen. The thermochromic ink had cost me $400 and a cryptocurrency transaction to a chemistry doctoral candidate in New Jersey. Under UCC Article 3, Desmond said slowly, a document that materially alters after execution is void ab initio, void from the beginning. Exactly. Desmond leaned back in his chair, something between admiration and ethical discomfort crossing his face. How long have you been planning this? There's a specific arithmetic to betrayal. 3 days before signing that postnup, I had stood in Ronan's home office at 2 a.m. swapping his Mont Blanc for a chemically identical pen filled with thermochromic ink. He had been asleep upstairs. I had memorized his desk arrangement, pen angle cap, orientation placement, relative to leather blotter. When he signed 3 days later, he never noticed. That's the arithmetic: 3 days of premeditation, 8 seconds of dissolution, one voided document. The equation balanced perfectly. Long enough, I said. Friday morning arrived with the sharp clarity of inevitability. The emergency hearing convened in Rivera Law Group's boardroom on the 47th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan's skyline. Chester Rivera sat beside Ronan, his expression professionally neutral. Clarice positioned herself near the door, observer status only. Ronan's attorney presented the post-nuptial amendment with calculated confidence. This agreement, executed November 2022, clearly establishes asset protection provisions that supersede. May I see the document under the overhead lights? Desmond interrupted. Chester's jaw tightened fractionally, but he slid the paper across the table. Desmond held it directly beneath the halogen fixture. The intense heat of the boardroom's commercial halogen bulbs did exactly what physics dictated. Within 8 seconds, entire paragraphs of the fraudulent postnuptial agreement dissolved into blank white paper under the 90-degree heat, leaving only the pre-printed legal header. My signature began fading first, then the amendment text. Within 8 seconds, entire paragraphs had dissolved into blank white paper, leaving only the pre-printed legal header. Silence filled the boardroom like a vacuum. I replaced your desk pen 3 days before I signed, I said, my voice steady. Thermochromic ink, 85 degrees. Ronan's face drained of color. His eyes moved from the blank paper to me. Comprehension dawning in stages: shock, then recognition, then something approaching fear. Under UCC Article 3, Desmond said, a document that materially alters is void ab initio. The court will note that no valid postnuptial agreement exists. Chester Rivera's eyes shifted. Immediate, dangerous pivot of strategy. He wasn't calculating Ronan's defense anymore. He was recalculating survival. The hearing concluded 17 minutes later. Ronan left without speaking, his attorney trailing behind him. Chester remained standing near the windows. I watched through the glass partition as Clarice approached Chester in the hallway. His body language showed urgent, controlled panic. Her hand rested on his forearm, steady and protective. Their conversation was muted through the glass, but Chester's jaw clenched visibly. Exposure if she has documentation, I read from his lips. Chester Rivera wasn't defending Ronan anymore. He was calculating how to sever ties, how to quarantine the contagion. Clarice stood between them like a fulcrum, loyal to Chester by marriage, allied with me by choice. The red Vance folder suddenly felt heavier in my memory. Chester's eyes met mine through the glass for one brief second before he turned away. Whatever insurance Clarice held in that folder, Chester knew about it now. And he was afraid. Chester's fear lasted 72 hours before it became rage. Clarice Rivera's call came at 2:47 p.m., her voice stripped of its usual courtroom control. He never leaves the office before dark. Today he came home at 1, locked the study door. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Through my Brooklyn apartment window, afternoon traffic moved in predictable patterns. What did you hear? Your name? Twice through the wall, then silence, then your husband's name. Clarice's breathing was audible, controlled, but rapid. He called Ronan 17 minutes ago. He's still in there. 17 minutes. Chester Rivera had spent 3 days calculating his exposure risk after the thermochromic ink reveal, and 17 minutes ago, he had chosen self-preservation over attorney-client privilege. He was tipping off Ronan to move assets before I could. Stay on the line, I said. I'm patching in Desmond. The three-way conference connected in 8 seconds. Desmond Foster's voice came through, sharp and immediate. Clarice, can you hear Chester's conversation now? No, the study door is solid oak, but I heard urgency, the tone you use when you're trying to contain a disaster. Desmond's keyboard clicked in the background. Chester will file for emergency asset freeze within 2 hours. Preliminary injunction hearing tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., earliest docket slot. How long do we have? My voice remained level despite the arithmetic already forming in my mind. 4 hours, maybe 3 if he has the paperwork pre-drafted. Another keyboard click. We need to initiate secondary transaction sequence now. The secondary transaction sequence. We had mapped this scenario 3 weeks ago. What to do if opposing counsel tipped off the target before we could secure marital assets. Desmond had pre-authorized the protocol for exactly this contingency. "I'm 20 minutes from your office," I said. "Clarice, can you get there in 40? "Yes." Her voice steadied. "I'll leave through the back entrance." The line went dead. What is the arithmetic of legal warfare? Chester's tip-off to Ronan, 17 minutes. Our three-way conference, 5 minutes. Transfer authorization window, 4 hours maximum. Desmond's pre-authorized protocol, 3 weeks of advance preparation. The law runs on timestamps, not intentions. Chester had moved first, but I had moved earlier 3 weeks earlier when we built the contingency that would save me now. I grabbed my coat and was out the door in 90 seconds. Foster law partners at 4:15 p.m. felt like a war room. Desmond had 3 laptops open across the conference table, banking interfaces glowing on each screen. Clarice arrived 6 minutes after me, her notary commission seal in a leather case under her arm. "You're a verified joint account holder on the marital cash reserves," Desmond said, sliding a tablet toward me. "This transfer is legally unimpeachable if executed before injunction filing." The screen showed our primary joint account. Balance $4,200,000. Below it, a pre-filled wire transfer form with destination account labeled Court-Monitored Escrow SDNY Case Pending. 4.2 million, I said. Court-monitored escrow, execute now. Desmond turned to Clarice. "Your notarization makes this ironclad. Under New York banking law section 675, a notarized identity certification on transfers over 1 million creates presumption of validity." Clarice opened her leather case. The notary seal, her legitimate commission seal, not Chester's stolen corporate seal, sat next to an ink pad and certification forms. She positioned the documents with practiced precision. "I, Clarice Helena Rivera, Notary Public for the State of New York, do hereby certify that the person appearing before me this 3rd day of April 2023 has provided valid government-issued identification and signed this instrument of her own free will under oath." She stamped the certification with deliberate pressure. The seal made a sound like a judge's gavel brass striking paper permanents hammered into pulp. Then Desmond produced the second document, a cover instrument confirming my status as corporate principal authorized to direct escrow deposits. At the bottom, Chester Rivera's stolen corporate seal waited to be applied, the same seal Clarice had extracted from his home safe 4 days ago. "This establishes you as authorized principal," Desmond explained. "The court will see Rivera Law Group's corporate seal certifying your escrow authorization. Chester can't dispute it without admitting his seal was compromised, which implicates his entire offshore notarization network." Clarice pressed Chester's stolen seal onto the cover instrument. The brass embossing caught the conference room light, creating shadows across the paper's texture. $4.2 million moved irreversibly in 11 keystrokes and 1 oath. My hand hovered over the tablet's authorized transfer button. The screen's blue glow reflected off the conference table's polished surface. Everything I had built toward for 3 years compressed into this single action. I pressed the button. The transfer protocol initiated identity verification, dual-factor authentication, account, authorization, routing confirmation. Progress bar moving left to right. Estimated completion time 7 minutes. Clarice's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. "Chester just left the house. He's heading downtown." "To file the emergency motion," Desmond said. "We're in the race now." 7 minutes felt like 7 hours. The progress bar reached 93%, then paused. Desmond's jaw tightened. Clarice's fingers drummed once against the table, then stopped. 97%. 100%. Transaction cleared 5:41 p.m. Desmond exhaled. Then his phone vibrated. He read the screen, his expression shifting from relief to calculation. "Chester filed emergency motion at 5:15 p.m. Hearing scheduled tomorrow 9 a.m. The numbers arranged themselves in my mind with brutal clarity. Transaction cleared 5:41 p.m. Emergency motion filed 5:15 p.m. Time difference 26 minutes. "We beat him by 26 minutes, I said. Desmond closed his laptop with careful precision. "You won the transfer race, but he's already triggered the counterstrike. Tomorrow morning, a judge decides if you moved fast enough or if his preliminary injunction retroactively freezes what you just transferred." Clarice gathered her notary seal, sliding it back into the leather case. Chester will argue you dissipated marital assets in bad faith. He'll demand the court reverse the transfer and sanction you for asset flight. Let him argue. I stood, pulling my coat from the chair. I have 2 hours before he secures that injunction. Let's make them count. The transaction had cleared. The war had escalated. And tomorrow at 9 a.m., I would face Chester Rivera across a courtroom and discover exactly how far a desperate attorney would go to protect his own exposure. Chester went farther than I expected, faster too. The taxi hadn't moved in 11 minutes when Desmond Foster's call came through, his voice stripped of professional calm. Manhattan traffic gridlocked around Herald Square Saturday afternoon, rush compressed into immobility. Through the window, pedestrians moved faster than vehicles. Chester intercepted the filing, Desmond said without preamble. He's arguing the notary stamp deviates 3 millimeters from standard alignment. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Spatial deviation doesn't invalidate verified notary signature under New York RPAPL Section 309 if text remains legible. I know, but he's moving for emergency ex parte asset freeze, filing within the hour. 3 millimeters. Chester Rivera had chosen technical precision as his weapon, the kind of procedural grasping that signaled desperation. He needed any flaw, any microscopic irregularity to stall the transfer I had executed yesterday at 5:41 p.m. Quote him, RPAPL, Section 309, I said. Notary signature legibility, not spatial precision. The statute doesn't measure millimeters. Desmond's keyboard clicked in the background. He's claiming the deviation suggests fraudulent application, that Clarice applied the seal under duress or without proper witnessing protocol. Escrow's already locked. Funded and irreversible as of yesterday evening. Court escrow accounts freeze on receipt. Chester can file 100 motions, the money's no longer in marital accounts. The taxi lurched forward 6 feet, then stopped again. A horn blared 2 cars ahead. I calculated the timeline. Chester's emergency motion filed today, Saturday afternoon. Ex parte motions require 48 hours minimum to process over weekends. Earliest hearing Monday morning, 9 a.m. Ex parte takes 48 hours minimum to process over a weekend, I said. We cleared the window. Desmond exhaled relief mixed with residual tension. He's desperate. 3 millimeters is the kind of argument you make when you've already lost. 3 millimeters. That's the margin Chester Rivera chose for his counterattack, 1/10 of an inch, the width of 2 stacked pennies. Legal warfare measured infractions statutes cited to 3 decimal places ex parte motions filed on Saturday afternoons. Precision as desperation. Chester wasn't defending Ronan anymore. He was defending himself, throwing procedural obstacles at a train that had already left the station. The escrow was locked, the transfer complete, and Monday's hearing would confirm what Chester already knew: he had lost the race. Let him file, I said. I'll see you Monday at 8:30. The line went dead. Traffic began to move. Before I reveal what Francis Henderson said on that Miami call, are you still here? Comment. A, if you think an uncle stays loyal to his nephew, or B, if past favors trump family. Add Y in 5 to 10 words. Please note the next part contains recreated details for storytelling depth. The message is what matters. Sunday morning arrived with the clarity of inevitability. I stood in the Tribeca penthouse kitchen at 9:20 a.m., coffee untouched on the counter when the call came through. Miami area code 305. I answered on the second ring. This is Francis Henderson. The voice was older, careful, carrying the tremor of someone about to break a family covenant. Ronan's uncle. You're the attorney who provided exculpatory evidence for my son Ryan. Ryan Henderson. 18 months ago, a fraud prosecution built on circumstantial digital forensics. I had found the exculpatory server logs, time-stamped proof Ryan was in Tampa when the alleged wire transfers originated from New York. 3 depositions, case dismissed. I remember, I said. I executed every instrument you sent last week. Francis's words came faster now, as if speed could reduce the weight of betrayal. Absolute power of attorney covering Ronan's offshore holdings. Cayman accounts, BVI, trust, the Miami receivables, all of it. Notarized Wednesday morning, filed Thursday afternoon. The kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Through the window, Manhattan's Sunday morning stretched across the skyline in muted grays and blues. When will he call? I asked. Within the hour. Francis paused, and I heard something break in that silence, the sound of a man choosing between nephew and son, between family loyalty and debt repayment. When Ronan calls to execute the wire transfer, I'm telling him the truth. Not because I hate him, because Ryan is my flesh and blood, and you saved my son when no one else would. Family betrayal has its own arithmetic. Francis Henderson chose son over nephew, blood over marriage distance relation. I had saved Ryan Henderson from a fraud prosecution 18 months prior, exculpatory evidence, 3 depositions, case dismissed. Now Francis repaid that debt by signing away his nephew's offshore access. Loyalty compounds interest. Ronan had built his financial empire on family trust offshore accounts managed by an uncle in Miami who held power of attorney over structures too complex for any single jurisdiction to untangle. But family trust has a price, and Francis had just calculated that price in the currency of his son's freedom. Francis, I said quietly, thank you. I'm not proud of this. His voice carried the weight of 63 years, the last 12 spent managing his nephew's offshore empire. But when you have to choose between your nephew's money and your son's future, the choice isn't really a choice. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, the glass surface cool against my palm. The apartment was silent that particular Sunday morning, quiet, where the city's noise becomes ambient background, indistinguishable from stillness. Then, from the bedroom wing above, Ronan's footsteps began to move. I knew that gait. 3 years of marriage teaches you the rhythm of someone's movement, the purposeful stride that meant he was heading somewhere specific, not wandering. The sound tracked across the ceiling, moving from bedroom toward the east wing, where his home office occupied the corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Tribeca. He was heading for his desk. The footsteps stopped. A door opened, the distinctive creak of his office door's upper hinge, then silence. Ronan was about to call Miami to execute the offshore wire transfer, unaware that the man on the other end was no longer his uncle in the way that mattered. Francis Henderson had already chosen sides, already signed the instruments that transferred power of attorney to me, already decided that loyalty to his son Ryan outweighed loyalty to his nephew Ronan. The man on the other end was no longer his ally. I waited in the kitchen, coffee still untouched, listening to the silence from above, where Ronan was about to discover that family betrayal can be purchased with exculpatory evidence and 18 months of gratitude. 47 minutes later, Ronan stepped onto the terrace for privacy. He moved at 10:14 a.m., phone pressed to his ear, Miami's 305 area code glowing on the screen. The terrace door remained open, deliberate carelessness born of desperation. I positioned myself near the interior dining space, right earring transmitter active, capturing every word through the 6-foot gap between inside and outside. Ronan's voice carried clearly across the threshold. Francis, authorization code 773 Baker. Move the entire liquid reserve to BVY holding accounts immediately. Silence. Then Francis Henderson's voice came through speakerphone, strained and careful. I cannot. Ronan's shoulders stiffened. What do you mean you cannot? I just gave you the authorization code. I executed full power of attorney last week. Francis's words arrived slowly, each syllable weighted with betrayal. Transferring control of the Cayman and BVY shells to your wife's legal representatives. The island accounts, everything locked. The terrace went silent, except for the faint rumble of Manhattan traffic 15 floors below. Ronan stood completely still, phone still pressed against his ear, the morning light casting his shadow across the terrace's stone tiles. What did you do? Ronan's voice dropped to something quieter than rage, comprehension mixed with disbelief. Francis, what did you do? She saved Ryan from indictment. Francis's voice cracked on his son's name. 18 months ago. Exculpatory evidence that kept him out of federal prison. Ryan is my son. I'm sorry. The line cut. Ronan stood frozen on the terrace, phone still pressed to his ear, as if Francis might materialize back on the line and take back the betrayal. His shoulders remained rigid, his stance unchanged, but I could see the micro-adjustments, the slight lean forward, the minute tilt of his head, the way his free hand gripped the terrace railing. The transmitter captured everything. Admission authorization code surrender. Francis Henderson's voice stating clearly and irrevocably that power of attorney had been executed, that offshore accounts were locked, that family loyalty had been purchased with a son's freedom. I remained perfectly still in the dining space, right earring recording the silence, documenting shock in real-time audio. Ronan finally lowered the phone. He stood on the terrace for another 43 seconds, I counted, before turning toward the door. I had already moved to the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, positioning myself as if I had been there the entire morning. He walked past without speaking, heading for his office, closing the door with the kind of careful control that signaled barely contained collapse. Blood chooses blood. Francis Henderson picked his son Ryan over his nephew Ronan 18 months after I provided the exculpatory evidence that kept Ryan out of federal prison. That's the currency of family loyalty. Saved sons trump fraudulent nephews. Ronan had built his empire on offshore structures managed by an uncle who valued family above law, never calculating that family loyalty could be redirected. I had saved Ryan Henderson with server logs and depositions, and Francis repaid that debt by severing Ronan's escape route. The arithmetic balanced perfectly. Monday morning at Foster Law Partners. Desmond Foster spread financial documents across the conference table with the precision of someone revealing a long-constructed architecture. Kensington Capital, he said, tapping the entity name on the cover sheet. Your shell company, funded by your father's $800,000 judgment 3 years ago, strategically reinvested to $12 million, holds 40% of his outstanding convertible bonds. I had established Kensington Capital 3 months before Ronan proposed. The name was deliberate, neutral, institutional, forgettable. I had used the settlement money as seed capital, investing in distressed commercial real estate that tripled in value over 18 months, then using that liquidity to purchase Ronan's convertible bonds at strategic discount during a market downturn he had engineered himself. And the conversion notice, I asked? Desmond slid another document across the table. Finalized at 8:47 this morning. Converting debt instruments to primary voting equity. As of now, you're the largest single shareholder of his firm. The document's header read, Notice of Conversion Debt to Equity, timestamped 8:47:23 a.m., April 6, 2023. Below it, the mathematics of corporate control, 40% bond holdings converted to voting shares, making me majority equity holder with operational authority over Henderson Capital Management. Desmond leaned back in his chair, eyes tracking the timeline. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., you walk into that boardroom as his primary institutional creditor. Majority equity holder with voting control over firm operations, asset liquidation, partnership, dissolution, everything. 3 years, I said. From my father's judgment to convertible bond acquisition to uncle's POA to conversion notice. Desmond's expression shifted, professional admiration mixed with something approaching ethical unease. You mapped this entire sequence before you let him put a ring on your finger. When do you build the trap? 3 years before engagement. Established shell company from father's judgment settlement. 2 years before wedding, purchase convertible bonds at strategic discount during market downturn. 1 year into marriage, cultivate relationship with Miami uncle's son, provide exculpatory evidence that saves him from indictment. 1 week before confrontation, secure uncle's POA, transferring offshore control. Sunday morning, 8:47 a.m. convert, debt to equity, securing majority shareholder position. Architecture built before the first kiss, executed before the first anniversary. Ronan never saw the foundation being poured. Desmond gathered the conversion documents into a leather portfolio. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., you'll enter that boardroom as majority shareholder. Chester Rivera will be there representing Ronan's remaining minority interests. It will be brief. How brief? Under corporate bylaws, majority equity holder can call for immediate operational audit and partnership restructuring vote. You'll control the outcome before lunch. I stood, checking my watch. 9:54 a.m. 24 hours and 6 minutes until the boardroom meeting, where I would walk in as Ronan's primary institutional creditor, majority equity holder, and the architect of his complete financial collapse. Desmond set down the portfolio, his gaze calculating the full timeline: shell company establishment to bond purchase to POA procurement to equity conversion. You mapped this before you let him put a ring on your finger. I grabbed my keys from the conference table. One last visit before 10 tomorrow morning. Desmond didn't ask where. He knew the answer the moment I said it, back to the Tribeca penthouse, back to the man who had spent 3 years believing he controlled the architecture, unaware that the foundation had been mine from the beginning. The elevator descended toward street level. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., I would enter that boardroom as majority shareholder. But first, one final piece needed to be positioned. Checkmate required precision, and I had 24 hours left to ensure there was no escape. The one last visit brought me to New York Presbyterian at 3:30 Monday afternoon. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic, and silence, my father's hand warm but unresponsive in mine. Vernon Morgan lay in the same position as yesterday, machines monitoring rhythms that continued without consciousness, breathing that happened without awareness. I pulled the chair closer to the bed, leaning forward until my voice would reach wherever he existed beyond the medical machinery. "Remember what you taught me when I was 12, Dad?" My voice stayed steady in the sterile quiet. Smartest person in the room is always the one who listens, never the loudest, never the one performing. The one who sits back, absorbs, and acts only when precision matters. The ventilator answered with its mechanical rhythm. Outside the window, Manhattan moved through late afternoon traffic patterns, the city indifferent to the small dramas playing out in hospital rooms across its geography. "Tomorrow I won't have to say much." I squeezed his hand gently. "Just lay the documentation on mahogany and let the numbers speak. Kensington Capital conversion filing, 40% voting equity, majority shareholder authority, everything we built from your judgment settlement." The machines continued their monitoring. His chest rose and fell with ventilator assistance. I had learned patience in this room, the kind that comes from watching someone you love exist in the space between life and death, present, but unreachable. "Your 800,000 became 12 million. I leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "Tomorrow it becomes justice." I kissed his forehead, skin warm, familiar, unchanged by unconsciousness, and stood. The chair scraped softly against linoleum. At the door, I looked back once. Vernon Morgan lay still, surrounded by machinery that kept him breathing while I finished what he had started. The hallway stretched ahead, fluorescent and sterile. I walked toward the elevator, pulling my phone from my bag. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. pre-board briefing with Sydney Reed. Desmond had scheduled it 72 hours ago, the moment we confirmed Kensington's conversion would clear. In the parking structure, I sat in the driver's seat for 3 full minutes before starting the engine. My father's $800,000 won in civil court against a predatory lender who destroyed 3 families became the seed capital for Kensington. Justice converted to equity, converted to voting control. His courtroom victory in 2020 became my financial architecture in 2023. He had sued a mortgage servicer that used fraudulent foreclosure documentation to seize homes from families who could prove they had never missed payments. 3 families lost everything before my father's case established the pattern. The settlement came too late for them, but it became the foundation for everything I built. Inheritance isn't just what you receive when someone dies. Sometimes it's what they give you while they still breathe, a lesson, a strategy, a judgment settlement that seeds a shell company 3 years before revenge becomes operational. I started the engine and drove toward the financial district. Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. Henderson Financial Group Tower's lower-tier conference room felt deliberately neutral, institutional carpeting, standard table, filtered light through vertical blinds. Sydney Reed sat across from Desmond and me, 71 years old, founding board member of Henderson Financial Group for 3 decades. Silver hair, pressed suit hands folded with the careful composure of someone who had survived multiple market crashes and corporate restructurings. He represented institutional memory, the kind of board presence that outlasted founders and weathered succession crises. Desmond slid wire telemetry documents across the table. 50 million in uncollateralized asset flight over the past 14 days. Shell companies routing through Caribbean jurisdictions. Every wire authorized personally by Ronan Henderson. Sydney reviewed the documentation with reading glasses perched on his nose, eyes tracking transaction codes and routing numbers. His expression remained neutral, professional, but I saw the calculation happening: institutional risk assessment, fiduciary exposure, regulatory attention. He's gutting operating capital to secure personal position. Sydney set the papers down with deliberate care. If these wires clear and the SEC initiates enforcement review, we're looking at full regulatory action. Enron scenario on a localized scale, smaller numbers, same structural fraud. As of Sunday, I said, sliding the Kensington Capital conversion filing across the table. I hold 40% voting equity. Majority shareholder with operational authority. I'm not here to destroy the firm. I'm here to preserve it. Sydney read the conversion document twice. His eyes moved from the header, notice of conversion debt, to equity down through the mathematics that transferred 40% bond holdings into controlling shares, timestamped 8:47:23 a.m., April 5th, 2023. How long have you held this map? Sydney looked up, eyes sharp despite his age. 3 years. I kept my voice level, factual. From my father's civil judgment to shell company establishment to bond acquisition to equity conversion. Kensington Capital was seated before Ronan proposed. Sydney leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, processing the timeline. You purchased the convertible bonds during the 2021 market downturn. I remember that quarter. Henderson Capital needed liquidity, offered bonds at steep discount to institutional buyers. 12% below par value, I confirmed. Kensington Capital qualified as institutional buyer, small entity but properly structured. What makes a board member switch allegiance? Not loyalty to personality, loyalty to institution. Sydney Reed spent 30 years building Henderson Financial Group's reputation, navigating regulatory changes, preserving client trust through market volatility. Watching its founder's son gut operating capital for personal escape meant watching institutional suicide. When I offered preservation over destruction, the choice was arithmetic. Sydney didn't owe loyalty to Ronan. He owed loyalty to the firm, to the clients whose assets sat in managed accounts, to the regulatory structure that kept everything operational. I had offered him a path to save the institution by removing the threat. Ronan had offered him complicity in corporate dismemberment. Desmond gathered the wire telemetry back into his portfolio. The boardroom session begins at 10 a.m. As majority shareholder, Mrs. Henderson has authority to call for immediate operational audit and partnership restructuring vote. Sydney stood slowly, adjusting his tie with deliberate precision. His eyes met mine with something between respect and calculation, recognition that he was witnessing institutional-grade acquisition executed with the kind of planning that required years, not months. In 30 years on this board, I've never seen an acquisition executed with this level of precision. He nodded once. Lead the way. I opened the conference room door, gesturing toward the elevator bank that would take us to the 47th floor where the boardroom waited. After you, Sydney. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Sydney stepped inside first. Desmond followed. I entered last, watching the doors close on the final 90 seconds before I walked into that boardroom as majority shareholder. 47 floors up, Ronan was already seated, unaware his founding board member had just switched sides. The elevator doors opened onto executive silence. I took the chair at the far terminus of the boardroom table. 12 board members between me and my husband's empty seat. The room was deliberate mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretching 47 floors below in Tuesday morning light. Sydney Reed sat mid-table, positioned strategically between institutional factions. Desmond Foster stood near the back wall, observer status, leather portfolio against his chest. The door opened at precisely 10 a.m. Ronan entered with Chester Rivera beside him, both in pressed suits, both carrying the composed urgency of men who believed they still controlled the room. Ronan took the opposite terminus chair without acknowledging me, his gaze sweeping the board members with practiced confidence. He opened the session before I could speak. Gentlemen, I've called this extraordinary session to initiate formal termination under the firm's moral turpitude clause. Ronan's voice carried institutional authority, the tone he used for quarterly earnings calls. My wife has engaged in malicious actions designed to compromise company assets and reputation. Chester Rivera, as legal counsel, will outline the documented evidence. Chester stood opening a folder with theatrical precision. Mr. Henderson has substantial evidence of coordinated interference, fraudulent notarization, unauthorized access to privileged offshore accounts, and conspiracy to manipulate corporate governance through shell entity fraud. The Moral Turpitude Clause. Ronan was attempting to terminate my standing before I could present evidence stripping institutional credibility by framing me as malicious actor rather than majority shareholder. Preemptive strike designed to poison the board's perception before the first slide appeared. I opened my laptop without speaking, Chester continued. Under partnership bylaws, moral turpitude constitutes grounds for immediate. Mrs. Henderson has no standing to present materials during termination proceedings, Chester said, voice sharp as I connected the laptop to the boardroom's central projection system. The screen behind Ronan's head illuminated, forcing him to turn away from the board to see what I was displaying. Sidney Reed leaned back in his chair, eyes tracking between Ronan and me with deliberate neutrality. She holds institutional creditor status, Sidney said quietly. Let her speak. Chester's jaw tightened. Ronan's hand gripped the armrest, knuckles whitening fractionally. I clicked to the first slide without verbal preamble. The projection displayed verified federal wire transfer logs, dates, authorization codes, receiving account numbers arranged in forensic sequence. 6 months of systematic capital movement, each transaction documented with bank routing confirmations and offshore receiving institution identifiers. Gentlemen, your CEO is systematically stripping this firm's operating liquidity to fund a personal flight profile. My voice remained level, factual. $50 million over 6 months routed through shell companies to Caribbean offshore accounts. The room erupted in immediate shock. 12 board members leaning forward simultaneously, eyes fixed on the projection screen behind Ronan's head. Numbers don't lie in boardrooms. Wire transfers carry timestamp authority that supersedes verbal denial. Ronan turned to face the screen, his expression shifting from confidence to controlled alarm. This is standard international M&A capital allocation for pending acquisitions. Chester provide the board with, "Stop." Sidney Reed's voice cut through the room with 3 decades of institutional weight. I reviewed these files last night with forensic accountants retained by the board. There is no acquisition. There are no pending M&A targets. This is corporate embezzlement. A heavy silence filled the space. The board members stared at the projection screen, watching the absolute displacement of Ronan's authority by a concrete paper trail. In this room, at this table, my years of preparation had finally made evidence out of his arrogance. I advanced to the next slide. Kensington Capital Conversion Notice dated April 6, 2023, time stamped 8:47:23 a.m. 40% voting equity via convertible bond conversion, establishing majority shareholder position with operational authority over firm management, asset allocation, and partnership restructuring. Kensington Capital holds 40% voting equity as of yesterday morning. I said, I am not here to negotiate marital asset distribution. I am here as your primary institutional creditor with fiduciary authority to protect this firm's operational integrity. Ronan's face shifted through comprehension in real time, calculating backward from conversion notice to bond purchase to shell company establishment. Kensington is who controls Kensington. I do. I have since its founding 3 years ago. The board members turned to Sidney Reed for confirmation. He nodded, once slow, deliberate, carrying 30 years of credibility. Chester Rivera's face drained of color. His eyes moved from the projection screen to me, recognition dawning across features that had spent weeks attempting to defend Ronan's offshore architecture. He understood immediately: 3-year acquisition strategy, convertible bond positioning, equity conversion, time to corporate crisis. Institutional-grade precision, executed before engagement, operational, before wedding, finalized before confrontation. When does evidence displace denial? Not at first revelation. Humans resist data that contradicts identity. But when a founding board member confirms forensic review, when the institutional elder validates the accusation, denial becomes untenable. Sidney Reed's single nod carried 30 years of credibility. 3 market crashes survived, 2 CEO transitions navigated. Ronan had been on the board for 7 years. In the arithmetic of institutional trust, decades outweigh ambition. Sydney's confirmation transformed my presentation from accusation to established fact. The board shifted allegiance not because they believed me over Ronan, but because Sydney Reed's validation made disbelief professionally indefensible. The boardroom fell into suspended silence. Ronan stared at the projection screen, $50 million of wire transfers glowing in federal banking font authorization codes. He had personally entered account numbers he had established through Chester Rivera's offshore legal network. Then his eyes moved to me across 12 seated board members, across mahogany and institutional protocol and 3 years of marriage that had concealed 3 years of strategic positioning. His face went entirely blank. Not shock, he had known this confrontation was inevitable the moment Francis Henderson severed his Miami access. Not rage emotion would undermine the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not surrender, Ronan Henderson didn't collapse under pressure. Calculated emptiness. Chester leaned toward him, whispering urgently, "We need to recess and regroup. Move for procedural delay on grounds of—" "No!" Ronan's voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the precision of someone who had just made a decision. "Continue." Sydney Reed's eyes narrowed fractionally. Desmond shifted against the back wall leather portfolio, tightening against his chest. I recognized the expression on Ronan's face, the same blank calculation I had seen when he realized the postnuptial had dissolved under thermochromic ink when Francis Henderson had severed his offshore escape. He wasn't conceding, he was recalculating. One final card remained unplayed, and he was about to put it on the table. He put it on the table. Ronan stood chair scraping against polished floor, voice regaining its courtroom edge. "You have a ledger of wire transfers, dates, account numbers, routing codes, all document entries that can be manipulated by anyone with system access." He locked eyes with me across the boardroom table, across 12 seated board members, and 3 years of marriage that had concealed 3 years of strategic planning. "But you lack a single piece of direct evidence connecting my voice to these authorizations." His words came faster now, defensive precision reasserting itself. "No audio recording of me issuing transfer instructions, no verified voice sample linking me personally to offshore account management. You have spreadsheets and wire confirmations, but you have nothing proving I personally authorized any of this." The room fell entirely still. Chester Rivera leaned forward slightly, recognizing the legal opening reasonable doubt, built on absence of direct proof. Sydney Reed remained motionless, eyes tracking between Ronan and me. Desmond Foster's grip on his leather portfolio tightened fractionally. Ronan's voice dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. "You have nothing linking me personally to these transfers. Nothing." I held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then my right hand moved slowly to my right earlobe. The diamond stud earring, unclipped with the softest metallic whisper, 2.3 carat stone in platinum setting, purchased at Tiffany Fifth Avenue, presented in navy blue box on our first anniversary, with a card that read, "For the woman who listens better than anyone I know." I placed it deliberately on the polished mahogany, the diamond catching boardroom light and scattering it across the table's surface. "You're entirely right, Ronan." My voice remained level, factual. "I didn't record you." I turned the earring over, revealing the backing, not standard butterfly clasp, but miniature data port embedded in platinum micro USB pin barely visible to naked eye. "You recorded yourself, for me." Ronan's face drained of color. What are you?" I connected the earring's data port to my laptop with a cable Desmond had provided. 12 board members leaned forward simultaneously, eyes fixed on the small platinum piece of jewelry that had spent 2 years against my skin, positioned perfectly to capture every conversation within 15-foot radius. "Rhett Ward modified this 3 weeks after you gave it to me," I said. "Brooklyn Heights audio surveillance specialist. The modification cost $11,000 and required 4 days of laboratory work to miniaturize the transmission hardware without compromising the diamond's visual integrity. Marriage operates on trust. So does surveillance." The earring was his anniversary gift. 2.3 carat diamond studs, platinum setting, purchased at Tiffany Fifth Avenue, with a personal consultation that lasted 45 minutes, while the jeweler explained cut clarity and color grading. I wore them every day for 2 years. He never asked why I favored the right ear. Never questioned why I adjusted it constantly during his phone calls, during his terrace conversations, during his late-night office sessions when he thought I was asleep downstairs. Trust doesn't investigate. That's its fatal architecture. He had taught me that relationships were transactional, that vulnerability was weakness, that every interaction carried hidden calculation. So I calculated better. I clicked the audio file marked April_5_terrace_1016 AM. Ronan's voice filled the boardroom through ceiling-mounted speakers, unedited, undistorted unmistakably, his vocal signature, with the slight rasp that emerged when he was under pressure. Francis Authorization Code 773 Baker. Route the Cayman Reserves to BVY by midnight. 50 million needs to be entirely out of IRS visibility before the SEC expands their review scope. Shift beneficial ownership documents directly to me, no intermediate shells, no trustee buffers. I need clean title. Timestamp displayed on the projection screen, April 5th, 2023, 10:16:47 a.m. Ronan lunged forward, hands gripping the table edge. Illegal wiretap inadmissible in any court obtained without consent. Sit down. Sidney Reed's voice cut through the room with institutional authority. New York is one-party consent state. She was physically present during that recording, standing in the interior dining space while you spoke on the terrace with the door open. Entirely legal. Chester Rivera closed his briefcase with deliberate precision, the metallic latches clicking like punctuation marks on a finished sentence. He stood stepping back from the table. Attorney-client relationship terminated by criminal exposure. The boardroom double doors slid open. Two FBI special agents entered federal arrest warrants in leather credential cases, badges displayed on belt clips. They positioned themselves directly behind Ronan's chair with the practiced efficiency of people who had executed this procedure hundreds of times. Ronan Henderson, FBI Financial Crimes Squad. The senior agent's voice was professional neutral. Stand up, please. You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal embezzlement of corporate assets under Title 18 United States Code Sections 1343 and 1957. Chester moved toward the door, then paused. Say nothing, Ronan. Not one word until we arrange criminal defense counsel separate from my representation. Ronan stared at me across the boardroom table, across the wire transfer evidence still glowing on the projection screen across the small platinum earring, with its miniature data port sitting on polished mahogany like a piece of evidence in a museum display. You called them! His voice was barely audible. When? Sunday afternoon, I said. The moment the audio files were verified and timestamped by Desmond's forensic documentation team. When does love become evidence? When does the intimate whisper on a terrace become federal wire fraud documentation? When you marry someone who teaches you that every relationship is transactional, every promise is leverage, every vulnerability is weakness. Ronan Henderson had spent 3 years showing me how to think strategically, how to document thoroughly, how to convert emotion into arithmetic. He taught me to separate sentiment from evidence, personal attachment from institutional necessity, marriage vows from balance sheet reality. Then he acted surprised when I executed the lessons better than he did. Love became evidence the moment he made it clear that love was never the transaction's true currency. The FBI agent stepped behind Ronan's chair, hands positioned for escort protocol. He turned to me one final time, voice dropping to a whisper, audible only across the mahogany expanse between us. Did you ever love me? I held his gaze across 12 board members, 12 witnesses, to institutional collapse across $50 million of wire transfer evidence, and 3 years of strategic architecture and one small platinum earring that had recorded everything. The answer to that question, I said, voice flat and financial, no longer has a place on the balance sheet. The agents guided him toward the door, hands on his shoulders with professional restraint. Ronan looked back once, not at the projection screen with its damning evidence, not at Sidney Reed or the board members who had watched his empire collapse in 22 minutes. At me. Then the boardroom doors closed and he was gone. The boardroom held its silence for 11 seconds after the FBI escorts guided Ronan through the double doors. 12 board members remained seated, eyes fixed on empty spaces, the vacant chair at the far terminus, the projection screen still displaying frozen audio waveform from the earring recording the small platinum diamond stud sitting on polished mahogany where I had placed it minutes ago. Chester Rivera sat motionless at the table's opposite end, briefcase closed, hands folded with the careful precision of someone trying to disappear into furniture. Sidney Reed closed the folder containing wire transfer documentation with deliberate finality. The sound leather against paper broke the silence. Gentlemen, his voice carried institutional authority that came from 3 decades of navigating corporate crises. We have immediate obligations to address. A board member near the center raised his hand tentatively. Move to recess until we can consult. No recess. Sidney's tone left no room for debate. We proceed immediately. He stood adjusting his suit jacket with practiced efficiency. I move for immediate removal of the Chief Executive Officer under Section 7.3 of Corporate Bylaws. Grounds: criminal referral to federal authorities, absolute breach of fiduciary duty, systematic misappropriation of corporate reserves exceeding $50 million. Sidney's eyes swept the table. All in favor. 12 hands rose simultaneously. No hesitation, no discussion. No conflicted pause between personal loyalty and institutional necessity. Carried unanimously. Sidney's voice remained level factual. Ronan Henderson is stripped of all executive authority effective immediately. I assume interim chief executive duties pending permanent board appointment. He turned to me, eyes calculating the institutional reality that had shifted in 22 minutes. Mrs. Morgan, as primary institutional shareholder holding 40% voting equity, do you wish to enter a formal statement for the record? I closed my laptop, the screen going dark on the evidence that had dismantled 3 years of fraud in less than half an hour. Just one statement. I move to initiate a complete independent forensic audit of every subsidiary ledger, every offshore structure, every wire transfer authorization over the past 5 years. From the ground up. Sidney nodded once. So ordered. Corporate counsel will retain the Big Four accounting firm by close of business today. Audit scope to include all entities under Henderson Financial Group operational control. In the arithmetic of corporate survival, decades of institutional trust outweigh personal ambition. Sidney Reed and the board shifted allegiance instantly, not out of personal malice toward Ronan, but because his actions had become an existential risk to the empire they built. Sidney gathered his folders. This meeting is adjourned. The board reconvenes Friday morning at 9 a.m. for a preliminary audit briefing. The members filed out silently, eyes avoiding mine, shoulders carrying the weight of institutional collapse witnessed firsthand. Within 90 seconds, the boardroom was empty except for 3 people, Sidney near the door checking his phone. Chester Rivera still seated at the far end, and me standing by my laptop at the terminus position. Sidney looked up, made brief eye contact, nodded once, professional acknowledgement, and left. Chester remained. I disconnected the earring from my laptop, placed it in my jacket pocket, and walked toward the door. Chester stood as I approached, blocking the exit, not aggressively, but necessarily someone who needed to deliver one final message. Clarice signed a formal divorce petition at noon today. His voice was quiet, stripped of the courtroom projection that had defined 3 years of litigation. I agreed to waive all contestation entries, all asset disputes, and all custody complications. She requested I inform you directly. I held his gaze. Chester Rivera looked diminished, not physically smaller, but institutionally reduced, the kind of collapse that happens when your professional identity fractures under criminal exposure. You've won, he said. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. This was never about winning or losing Chester. She simply earned the right to own her own life. He nodded slowly, something between acknowledgement and surrender. The red folder. Vance contingency. She showed me last night. Documented everything shell company formations. I notarized offshore trust structures. I certified every backdated instrument I authenticated for Ronan's network. She held that insurance for 3 years. She held it until she needed it. I'm resigning from the Bar Association Friday. Chester's shoulders dropped fractionally. Before they initiate disbarment proceedings, Clarice gave me that option: resign with dignity or wait for the ethics investigation. I moved toward the door. He stepped aside. She'll be fine, I said, better than fine. Chester remained in the doorway as I walked toward the elevator bank. I pressed the call button, listening to the mechanical hum of cables pulling the car toward the 47th floor. 2 women filed for liberation on the same Monday. Clarice Rivera signed divorce papers at noon. Same hour, her husband's client was escorted by federal agents from the executive boardroom 7 floors above. We never coordinated timing. We never discussed synchronization of our exit strategies. But women who marry men who view marriage as leverage, who understand relationships as transactional instruments rather than emotional partnerships, develop the same survival instincts. We operate on the same frequencies, recognize the same patterns, calculate the same escape routes. Parallel recognition of the same fundamental truth ownership of your own life isn't negotiable, it's not a compromise, it's not a settlement distribution, it's absolute or it's imprisonment. Clarice held that red folder for 3 years, waiting for the moment when Chester's complicity would force him to choose between his career and his freedom. She had given him the option to resign with dignity. That was more mercy than most would offer. The elevator arrived, doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside, pressed the button for ground level, and turned as the doors began their slow glide shut. Through the narrowing gap, I watched Chester Rivera standing in the corridor, shoulders slumped, one hand against the wall for support, head lowered. He looked smaller than he ever had in court. Smaller than he'd looked defending Ronan across mahogany conference tables, smaller than he'd appeared that Friday when the thermochromic ink dissolved under halogen lights. The doors closed on his silhouette. One destination left before this day ended. The hospital corridor smelled the same as it had 3 years ago. Antiseptic and institutional silence. I walked toward Vernon Vance's private room at 3 p.m., still wearing the navy suit from the boardroom heels clicking against linoleum. The destination I had left unspoken. His room was unchanged. Same monitors displaying steady rhythms, same ventilator providing measured breaths, same afternoon light through vertical blinds. Vernon Vance lay in the position I had left him Sunday, eyes closed, chest rising with mechanical assistance. I pulled the chair close and took his hand. "Dad, it's me." My voice was soft, stripped of courtroom precision. "I need to tell you what happened today." The words came differently than Sunday's strategic briefing. This was recounting the kind daughter gives father when armor comes off. Your 800,000 became 12 million through Kensington Capital, then became 40% voting equity, then became justice. I watched his face for recognition. Nothing changed. But I continued. This morning at 10 a.m. I walked into the boardroom as majority shareholder. Ronan tried stripping my standing with moral turpitude before I could present evidence. Sidney Reed granted me presentation rights. My fingers tightened around his hand. I showed them everything. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, systematic embezzlement, $50 million stolen from his own firm. Sidney confirmed it, corporate fraud on institutional scale. The ventilator answered with mechanical whisper. Then Ronan demanded direct voice evidence, said documents could be manipulated without audio proof. I paused, remembering that calculated challenge. So I removed the earring. The anniversary gift you told me was too expensive. I wore the right one every day for 2 years. Rhett Ward modified it with recording transmitter. A faint smile crossed my face despite tears building. I played the audio. Ronan's voice authorizing offshore transfers, demanding 50 million moved out of IRS visibility. Sidney confirmed one-party consent entirely legal. My throat tightened. FBI entered at 10:20. 2 agents with federal warrants. Wire fraud, money laundering, criminal embezzlement. They escorted him out in front of 12 board members. I leaned closer, voice breaking. Henderson was taken out in federal cuffs today, Dad. I finished it, like you taught me. His fingers tightened around mine. I gasped, eyes snapping to the vitals monitor. Heart rate baseline 67 beats per minute, shifting to 70 beats per minute, holding 4 seconds, returning to baseline. 3 beats per minute, spike lasting exactly 4 seconds. Too subtle for automated alert, too brief for intervention, but unmistakable to the daughter holding his hand. Dad, my voice cracked, you heard me. 3 beats per minute. That's the margin between coma and consciousness, between neurological silence and recognition. Medical staff wouldn't flag 3 beats per minute variants, too subtle for alerts, too brief for protocols. But when you've held someone's hand 3 years waiting for response, you know the difference between reflex and intentional squeeze. 3 beats per minute synchronized with finger pressure. 4 seconds elevated heart rate timed to daughter's confession. Enough to say I heard you. I understand. I'm proud. I lowered my head onto white hospital sheets beside his arm and wept. Not cold strategic tears manufactured for Ronan's benefit. Profound release, 3 years of controlled rage and strategic precision finally shattering against hospital cotton. My shoulders shook. Fingers tightened around his unmoving hand. Monitors continued steady rhythms. No staff entered. Father's breathing remained constant. I did it. I sobbed into sheets. Exactly what you would have done. Listened, calculated, executed without mercy when arithmetic demanded it. You taught me everything. Separate emotion from strategy. Build architecture before declaring war. Convert justice into equity, equity into control, control into institutional power. I lifted my head, wiping tears, still holding his hand. The vitals monitor displayed baseline no further variance, 67 beats per minute, steady. But I didn't need medical confirmation. When do you stop being someone's weapon and become their daughter again? Not when mission ends. Missions create exit strategies, not identity restoration. Not when target is removed. Removal is tactical, not transformational. But when you sit beside hospital bed recounting victory and feel 3 beat per minute heart spike through unconscious hand squeeze. Permission granted without words, you fulfilled expectation, now reclaim self. Daughter, not instrument. The arithmetic finally balanced. 3 beats per minute was enough, I whispered. I did exactly what you expected, exactly what you trained me for since I was 12. I held his hand, watching afternoon light shift across walls as Manhattan moved through final hours of the day that started with boardroom confrontation and ended with father's subtle benediction. For the first time in 3 years, I'm letting myself be your daughter again. Not your weapon, your daughter. The monitors continued their rhythm. Ventilator maintained its cycle. Vernon lay still, eyes closed, breathing assisted. But his hand remained warm in mine, and memory of that 3 beat spike remained burned into consciousness like evidence that couldn't be erased. He had heard, he had understood, he had responded. I sat with him for 17 more minutes watching the monitor display steady baseline, no additional variance, but I didn't need medical chart confirmation. 3 beats per minute after 3 years of flatline baseline, he had heard me, understood what I had done, given permission to reclaim myself. I had done exactly what he expected, and for the first time since his collapse 3 years ago, I allowed myself to be his daughter again. 2 weeks after I reclaimed myself as daughter, the legal system demanded I reclaim myself as individual. Ronan's signature on the divorce execution line looked nothing like the confident script I'd watched him use for 3 years. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, pressed too hard into paper, ink bleeding through to the page beneath. Psychological collapse visible in every stroke. I sat in Foster Law Partners' conference room studying the document Desmond had placed before me at 11 a.m. April 21st. 2 weeks since FBI agents escorted my husband from the executive boardroom in federal custody. Executed from Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn this morning, Desmond said, standing beside the table. His criminal defense attorney countersigned as witness. I traced the signature line with my eyes. Ronan Henderson. The letters tilted at inconsistent angles, spacing irregular, final stroke trailing off like exhaustion. His signature looks broken, I said. Federal detention has that effect. Desmond slid the full settlement document across mahogany. Terms are exactly what we proposed: full confirmation of Kensington Capital, 40% equity position, absolute release of the escrow reserves to you, total title transfer of offshore real estate surrendered via Francis Henderson's power of attorney. I flipped through pages documenting systematic dismantling of 3-year marriage, asset schedules, equity confirmations, debt allocations, everything reduced to line items and dollar amounts. He accepted without contestation, Desmond continued. No counterproposals, no asset disputes, no custody complications. Complete capitulation. I reached the signature page, the section requiring my execution to finalize dissolution. Desmond placed a pen on the table beside my hand. Mont Blanc, black lacquer. Same pen I'd used to sign the prenuptial agreement 3 years prior. I recognized the small scratch on the cap. Your signature line, he said quietly. Final execution. I lifted the pen, positioned it above the blank line, and signed deliberately Elodie Vance. Not Elodie Morgan. Not Elodie Henderson. Elodie Vance. The name I had carried for 24 years before marriage, the name that existed before strategy consumed identity. Desmond watched the signature take shape, then nodded once. Officially, you've returned to your own name, Elodie Vance, no Henderson. I set the pen down. First legal document bearing my original identity since the marriage certificate. Reclamation, Desmond said, not regression. Names carry weight. Henderson was borrowed identity 3 years wearing someone else's surname like costume required for institutional access. Marriage certificate signed with maiden name divorce petition filed as Henderson, final execution reclaiming Vance. Full circle, but the circumference contained 3 years of strategic warfare. Vance was mine before marriage, mine after dissolution. Reclaiming maiden name isn't regression, it's archaeological excavation, removing layers of acquired identity to expose original foundation. Elodie Vance. The person who existed before strategy consumed personality, before weapon eclipsed daughter, before marriage became warfare. Not restoration. Reclamation. 3 weeks later, the corporate transformation finalized. I sat in the corner office on the 42nd floor, formerly Ronan's operational headquarters, reviewing documentation Sydney Reed had placed on the desk at 10 a.m. May 15th. Shareholder vote cleared registry at 9:07 this morning, Sydney said, standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. 11 to 2 abstentions from minority loyalist shareholders. Conglomerate officially rebranded Vance and Kensington Group. I studied the new letterhead corporate logo, redesigned Henderson name entirely absent from header. 3 decades of brand equity erased in 73 minutes of shareholder voting. Henderson completely removed from corporate registry, I asked. Completely. Sydney adjusted his reading glasses. Building signage scheduled for replacement next week. New business cards printing this afternoon. Legal name change filed with New York State Department of State this morning. Vance and Kensington Group. My father's surname and my shell company's name merged into institutional identity that replaced the Henderson brand Ronan had spent 8 years building. The board has one additional matter requiring your consideration. Sydney returned to the desk, folding his hands with the careful precision of someone delivering rehearsed proposal. We're formally requesting you consider assuming permanent chief executive officer position. You hold 40% equity. You've earned the authority. I looked at the photograph I had placed on the desk corner that morning. Vernon Morgan in his litigation days standing outside courthouse steps after winning the predatory lender case that had generated the settlement seating everything that followed. I accept chairwoman of the board, I said, but you remain CEO Sydney. His eyebrows raised fractionally. You're certain this is your firm now? The firm needs a leader who understands its historical institutional roots. I met his eyes across the desk. You provide continuity, 30 years of corporate memory, client relationships, market credibility. I'll focus on building new strategic infrastructure, division of labor. What's the difference between inheriting your father's company and building your own? Vernon fought predatory lenders, won judgment, seeded my shell company from hospital bed. His courtroom victory became my equity foundation. But Vance and Kensington Group isn't his firm. It's reconstruction built on his settlement. Inheritance provides capital. Legacy requires new architecture. He gave me tools. I'm building forward, not managing backward. Sydney brings institutional wisdom. I bring strategic vision. Together, transformation, not succession. Sydney nodded slowly. Chairwoman and Chief Executive Officer, Institutional Partnership. Exactly. He gathered his documentation. Board briefing begins in 12 minutes. I'll inform them of your decision. Sydney exited, closing the door with soft precision. I remained at the window studying Manhattan's grid 42 floors below, steel and glass towers stretching across the island, morning light reflecting off corporate headquarters financial district spreading south toward Battery Park. The exact view Ronan had surveyed as personal kingdom for 8 years. To me, just a city. Just one more landscape requiring strategic navigation. One more grid of institutional relationships and financial leverage points and corporate hierarchies to map and understand and position within. But beneath the institutional victory, the divorce finalized, the corporate rebranding complete. The chairwoman title secured, one recognition surfaced clearly. One more debt to close before I could truly begin. Not financial debt. Those had been calculated, allocated, distributed across settlement schedules and equity confirmations. This was personal obligation. One final thread from the 3-year campaign remained unresolved, one relationship requiring closure, before forward momentum could become genuine reconstruction rather than continued warfare. I looked at Vernon's photograph on the desk, then back at Manhattan's indifferent skyline. One more debt, personal not institutional, human cost not financial balance sheet. And I knew exactly where to begin. The place to begin was a phone call I hadn't expected. Clarice Rivera's voice on Saturday morning sounded lighter than I'd ever heard it. 23 years of weight lifted in 6 weeks. "I'm sitting in a studio apartment in Midtown," she said through the phone pressed against my ear. 20 times smaller than the house he kept me in. I prefer it infinitely. I stood at my own apartment window overlooking a different section of Manhattan than the corporate tower provided. Smaller space, but mine. No strategic positioning required, just residence. "How does independence feel?" I asked. "Like breathing without permission." Her voice carried genuine lightness, the kind that comes from autonomy, earned rather than granted. Morning coffee without calculating Chester's mood, evenings without performance anxiety, first genuine freedom in decades. I recognized the arithmetic in her voice, the same calculation I had performed leaving the hospital after Vernon's 3-beat-per-minute response. Weight removed, identity reclaimed, strategic armor no longer required for survival. "The trust fund I established," I said. "It ensures you don't have to accelerate professional choices out of desperation. You have time to build without pressure." Long pause on the line. Traffic sounds filtered through her end city noise that meant motion possibility, lack of isolation. "Why did you protect me like this?" Clarice's question carried genuine confusion. "We barely knew each other before the conspiracy. I was Chester's wife, your husband's attorney's spouse. Why secure my future?" "Because you deserved a clean slate." The answer was simpler than strategy, more fundamental than calculation. "You stole his corporate seal from a home safe and handed me institutional leverage. You held the Vance folder as insurance. You notarized my identity under oath. You earned autonomy." Another pause, longer this time. "Thank you, Elodie." First time she'd used my first name. Not Mrs. Henderson. Not formal address maintaining hierarchical distance. Elodie, peer relationship established through parallel liberation, 2 women who had conspired against men who viewed marriage as institutional control rather than partnership. I registered the shift. "You deserved it, Clarice." We spoke for 11 more minutes about nothing strategic. Her Midtown neighborhood. The coffee shop 2 blocks from her studio, the library card she'd acquired. Conversation without agenda. Then she ended the call with promise to meet for lunch the following week. I set the phone down, looking at Manhattan's grid through my window, and recognized the personal debt partially closed. Clarice secured independent breathing without permission. One debt remained. 18 months. That's the distance between boardroom arrest and federal sentencing, enough time for forensic accountants to map every wire transfer for prosecutors, to build irrefutable case for defendant, to recognize trial means 35 years instead of 20. Enough time for Clarice to establish independent life in Midtown studio. Enough time for me to rebrand, conglomerate accept chairwoman position, established trust fund, protecting co-conspirator I barely knew. Enough time for wounds to scar rather than bleed. 18 months, the arithmetic of aftermath, the space between collapse and consequence. September 12, 2024, Southern District of New York Federal Courthouse. Ronan Henderson stood before the bench in prison-issue navy suit, hands cuffed at waist, shoulders rigid with the kind of posture that tries to maintain dignity under institutional erasure. Confronted with forensic evidence mountains spanning 3 continents in 6 years, he had waived trial rights, signed comprehensive federal plea agreement. The judge's voice carried institutional authority that made boardroom power look theatrical. Wire fraud under Title 18 United States Code Section 1343, 20 years. Tax evasion under Title 26 Section 7201 concurrent. Securities fraud under Title 15 Section 78J concurrent. Total effective sentence 20 years federal custody. Parole eligibility 12 years. Desmond sat beside me in the gallery, hands folded. He leaned close, whispered, Plea agreement saved him from 35. Ronan was escorted through the side hatch orange prison issue, replacing the navy courtroom suit. He passed the gallery, caught my silhouette in the third row, stopped for a fraction of a second. His eyes met mine across institutional distance. He said nothing, kept walking. I didn't track his exit, just watched the hatch door close with mechanical precision, sealing him into federal custody for the next dozen years minimum. Institutional closure delivered by judge's gavel and federal sentencing guidelines. But one conversation remained. Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn, 4:30 that afternoon. I sat in visiting facility behind plexiglass partition, watching Ronan appear in orange prison issue. 18 months of detention had aged him a decade, lines around eyes, shoulders, carrying weight that boardroom confidence never showed. He lifted the receiver. "Why are you here to look at the wreckage you created?" I pressed the handset close. "I want you to understand exactly why this architecture collapsed around you." His voice carried familiar sneer despite institutional diminishment. "Retribution. You destroyed me because I—" "No." My tone remained absolutely calm. "Justice for Vernon Vance." He went silent, the name registered without comprehension, recognition of syllables without understanding significance. Who? What's the difference between justice and retribution? Retribution is personal, emotional satisfaction from enemy suffering, revenge measured in pain inflicted. Justice is institutional restoration of balance through systematic accountability, debt repaid with compound interest. Vernon Vance's settlement became my capital, became 40% equity, became corporate reconstruction. Not revenge. Arithmetic. The calculation took 3 years to execute, 18 months to finalize through federal prosecution. Justice doesn't hurry. It compounds. I opened my briefcase, extracted small transparent evidence box, placed it into secure metal slide-through compartment between us, pushed it across the partition. Ronan looked down at the object inside, then back up at me. His hand hovered above the box, fingers frozen mid-reach. "What is this?" The question carried confusion, not comprehension. He recognized the object but couldn't understand why I possessed it, why I'd purchased it from federal forfeiture, why I'd brought it to detention center visiting room on the day of his sentencing. "Something that belonged to you," I said with clinical precision. "I bought it from the federal asset forfeiture auction this morning." His fingers remained suspended above the transparent evidence box. Recognition dawning slowly behind plexiglass in 18 months of institutional processing. He stared at the object, then at me, then back at the box, and his hand began to shake. His hand shook above the evidence box because he recognized the contents immediately. Inside the transparent case lay the diamond stud earrings Ronan had gifted me on our first anniversary, 2.3 carats each, platinum setting, purchased at Tiffany, 5th Avenue. The ones I had worn every day for 2 years. The ones that had recorded his confession. I watched his fingers hover, trembling. "I had the acoustic transmitter removed," I said through the partition phone. "But the biometric sensor remains functional. I gifted the earrings to Captain Morrison, Regional Warden, managing Block A, where you'll serve your 20 years. Ronan's eyes snapped from the box to my face. The sensor chip was formally installed inside the primary dayroom console. I continued with clinical precision. "It records data to local flash memory, only violates no federal transmission regulations. Every 30 days, Captain Morrison downloads the log telemetry and transmits a PDF to my office." His voice came out hoarse. "Why, every time your pulse spikes from rage, panic, realization of what you threw away, I'll have the coordinate on a graph, time-stamped, categorized, filed." "To celebrate?" The question carried desperate edge. "No," I held his gaze through plexiglass. "To remember. Surveillance isn't celebration." The biometric sensor tracking Ronan's pulse spikes for 20 years wasn't trophy. It was mirror. He built tool to dominate track control. I repurposed his architecture into permanent reminder. Your little red dot measures time behind walls, the way you measured my father's economic collapse. Not revenge, symmetry. Every 30 days, PDF arrives. I file it unread most months. Some debts don't require daily attention. Just permanent ledger entry proving accountability persists beyond courtroom sentencing. Your little red dot will track time behind 4 walls, I said. The exact way you boxed my father into economic prison of debt and stroke-induced silence. Ronan's face shifted through calculations, searching for angle leverage counterargument. He found none. You never loved me. His voice dropped to something between accusation and plea. I paused, choosing words with the same precision I had chosen every move for 3 years. I loved you for 3 years, I said quietly. Before I found out who you were? Before I discovered what you had done to Vernon Vance? Before I understood that our marriage was built on money stolen from my father's settlement? His eyes widened fractionally. Vernon Vance was my father. Vernon Morgan changed his surname legally after the predatory lender case. Too many harassment attempts, too much media attention. He wanted privacy for his recovery. You never investigated my maiden name, never checked my background beyond surface credentials. Ronan stared through a plexiglass comprehension, finally assembling. I didn't destroy your world, Ronan. My tone remained measured, final. I simply reclaimed my own. I stood, placed the handset back on its cradle, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Desmond waited outside the visiting facility, briefcase in hand, late afternoon September sun casting long shadows across Brooklyn pavement. Where do we route the files now? He asked as we descended concrete steps toward street level. Route everything to the office. I stopped at the sidewalk, letting autumn air hit my face. Brackish water scent from shipping channels, distant traffic rumble, ordinary city movement. Right now I need to find a deli. I missed breakfast. We merged into anonymous pedestrian flow. No cinematic explosion, no dramatic music cue. Just two people walking Brooklyn streets toward Corner Deli 3 blocks south. Nobody on that sidewalk had any idea the woman selecting turkey sandwich had just concluded 3-year chess match involving corporate espionage, FBI coordination, offshore asset seizure, and permanent biometric surveillance installation. I didn't need them to know. The board was clear. 2 months later. November 14th, I entered Vernon's hospital room at 8:30 p.m. after standard visiting hours, but before night nurse enforced departure. I approached his bedside, quietly monitors, displaying their familiar rhythms and ventilators, maintaining measured breaths. Reached into the pocket of his hospital gown and extracted folded paper I had placed there months ago, the paper from anniversary night with 2 names written in my handwriting. I unfolded it slowly, looked at the ink one final time, then tore it into clean fragments and dropped them into the waste bin beside his bed. Placing my palm over his hand, I leaned close and whispered, "Remember your favorite maxim, Dad? You always said, they can strip you of balance sheets but never steal the intelligence you gained by losing them." The monitor displayed a steady baseline. I continued anyway. I learned the lesson, Dad. Every single principle you taught me. Listen first. Calculate precisely. Execute without mercy when arithmetic demands it. And never let predators write the final lines of your history. The heart rate display shifted 67 beats per minute to 70 beats per minute. 3-beat increase lasting 4 seconds before returning to baseline. Second time in 2 years. Confirmation. What's the difference between destroying an enemy and reclaiming history? Destruction focuses backward, inflicting pain, proportional to pain, received revenge measured in enemy suffering. Reclamation focuses forward, rebuilding the foundation. Predators tried to erase, restoring the narrative they attempted to overwrite. I didn't need Ronan destroyed. I needed Vernon's legacy restored, Kensington equity secured, and a corporate banner rewritten. The 3-year campaign wasn't revenge. It was an archaeological excavation, removing the predator's narrative to expose the original truth. History finally and completely mine. I sat holding my father's hand until the night nurse signaled visiting hours close at 9:15. Vernon Vance might never open his eyes to see the Vance and Kensington banner on that financial district tower. Might never walk those halls as chairwoman's father, never witnessed the forensic audit results, never read the federal sentencing transcripts. But that night in the quiet hum of that hospital room, I didn't need him to wake up to know I had executed the brief he had given me the moment he collapsed 3 years ago. I hadn't stood still. I hadn't let the predator write the final lines of our history. I had reclaimed my maiden name, rebuilt my father's legacy, transformed borrowed corporate structure into a genuine institutional foundation, and ensured that the man who had stolen from us would spend 2 decades behind walls with a permanent reminder of exactly why he was there. The revenge note was destroyed. The earring would track Ronan's pulse for 20 years. Vernon's 3-beat spike had confirmed what I already knew. The 3-year campaign was complete. And now that history finally and completely belonged to me, and to you listening to my story, remember this. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent and takes 3 years to execute perfectly. I won't say I regret what I did. The woman who started this journey loved her husband. The woman who ended it learned that some betrayals can only be answered, not forgiven. Family revenge consumed 3 years of my life, years I'll never reclaim. Make sure your choices are worth the cost. Here's what I learned. When family revenge becomes necessary, you have two paths. Let anger destroy you, or channel it strategically. I chose strategy and patience. I believe God gave me the intelligence to see it through, not for vengeance, but for justice. There's a difference between destroying someone and reclaiming what they stole. I didn't need Ronan destroyed. I needed my father's legacy restored. If someone has wronged your family, understand this family revenge isn't about hate. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about ensuring predators don't write your family's final chapter. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Do you think what I did was justified? Would you have done the same for your family? If this story resonated, please share it. Subscribe to Her Revenge for more stories about standing up when it matters most. Thank you for staying until the end. Some details were adjusted for storytelling, but the message about family justice and reclaiming your narrative, that's what I hope stays with you.